the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is now time for another 3 hours of the most disruptive show in those states. In the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And as we do every morning, let's go into the news. In the news, Republican chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Lindsey Graham, sang the praises of Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett in the third day of hearings for her nomination to that Supreme Court, saying that, quote, "This is the first time in American history that we've nominated a woman who's unashamedly pro-life," end quote. His remarks cut into the concerns of many who are wary of an avowedly conservative Supreme Court. Barrett is widely expected to be nominated by the Republican-led Senate at the end of the month. Jamarl, we were having a back and forth on this one yesterday. This is a more strident comment than he's made in the past. He's singing her praises for being pro-life. Of course, this comes after saying that she hadn't made any commitments to roll back either Obamacare or Roe v. Wade. But, they don't need a commitment if they know where she's going. What's your take, Jamarl?
Exactly. That's exactly my point. It's like, you've made no commitments on this issue, and we appreciate that you haven't talked to anybody on this issue. I mean, that is the way Supreme Court, the judge is supposed to make their choice based on the case. However, I do want to thank you for being pro-life. Applause. I mean, it's like, come on. It's like, if you know where she is, you don't have to ask her, and you don't have to have conversations. And they're putting her there for the explicit reason of her because, come on, we're human beings, right? And a judge, just like a person, just like a dog walker, just like the barbershop guy, they're going to have certain ideas of the world, certain preconceptions of the world, and certain points of view. And those things are going to be sometimes by their experiences, by their class, by all sorts of stuff. And so the idea that there's an objective viewpoint looking at the law is not, nonsense. And you have some people that are more political than others, meaning some of those people.
I don't know that it goes that far.
You don't think it goes that far?
I think here's the thing. I can criticize it and I can sort of say what I just said, but there's another view that I can take, which is she's read the Constitution and her reading of the Constitution actually made her pro-life or something like that. I might have, that's probably not all that's going on there, but there can be a two-way relationship. It's not just biases leading to interpretations. It's, of course, your interpretations leading to your biases, and sometimes those interpretations are pretty well thought out. Now, what is true, nevertheless,
I don't buy that. I don't even know what's there to give you that.
Because she has the beliefs they want. Yeah, what's up?
Well, I was going to say most people take positions based on how they feel. I mean, they may come up with an intellectual argument to cast it in a particular way, but I don't buy for a moment.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Yeah, it's exactly that way. I mean, I don't believe for one moment that she read the Constitution and came away and said, "I'm pro-life" after reading the Constitution. I don't buy that.
I can see there being something like that. I could see her being raised in a family that takes, for instance, a constitutional tact. And then you're going to say, well, her family's biased. But I don't know, man.
No, I'm not going to say her family is biased. I'm going to say that makes my point. That she was either raised, her environment, and all that other stuff led to a particular opinion. That's my point.
Oh, man. We've got to come back.
Keep going.
This is going to be a fascinating conversation when we've got time for it.
Yeah.
Next headline here. President Trump and Joe Biden will hold competing town halls tonight in lieu of their now canceled second presidential debate. That cancellation came after online scuffling between the Trump and Biden campaigns over whether to go forward with a virtual debate. This followed Trump's contraction of COVID-19. The weekend before this last one, Trump last night held a rally in Iowa where he was reportedly in a dead heat with Joe Biden. That comes according to the polls, of course. And Biden's town hall, by the way, will be broadcast on ABC, while Trump's will be held on NBC. It's interesting to me that Trump's will be held on NBC and not Fox. I wonder if he's holding a slight grudge over the treatment he received there from Chris Wallace. But frankly, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe they don't want to have him because of how he talked over Chris Wallace repeatedly throughout that debate.
That's
I don't know. What's
funny.
your take, Jamarl?
I didn't think about that, but that's funny. Trump once before said that Roger Ailes, he was like, ever since Ailes left, Fox News have been treating him poorly or something like that. I don't know, but there's been this push now to get to boycott MSNBC. Have you seen that? There have been a big push, especially on Twitter and social media, to boycott MSNBC because Donald Trump is going to be doing his debate on their network.
Oh man!
That's
no,
sad. I know that's sad.
That is sad. Yeah, I NBC, according to my sort of limited, social political purview or whatever, that used to be the left network. Like I used to think of NBC is the left network and Fox is the right network. And then 2016 happened, and the lines got a lot more blurry because CNN and NBC, CNN would sometimes be to the left of NBC. I don't know where things are exactly now. But if NBC is still the sort of left of center network, I don't know. What's your take on that, Jamarl?
I just think it's the Democratic Party's network. That's the way I see it. I mean, that's why I don't like using the term left for Democrats, because it doesn't necessarily work all that well. Pro-war,
I hear you on that.
I mean, at this point, like war, capitalists, as Nancy Pelosi said. I mean, the leader of the party at this point is either a Biden, a Pelosi, a Schumer, and if that gives you any notion of if you mean the term left, I don't think it applies.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. It's confusing, man. We need one of the main problems of the whole declining political system here, one of the biggest problems is I don't know what words to use anymore. And that's not a good way to be. Anyway, in our next headline, in a 167-page report released on Thursday, Human Rights Watch said that attacks on civilian infrastructure in Idlib, that's the region in Syria, by the Syrian and Russian governments between April 2019 and March 2020 violated international law. I'm going to say it outright. I've given the headline there. I do not trust Human Rights Watch on this story. From what I've seen, supposedly independent humanitarian organizations have often acted as a glove for pursuing Western interests in regime change wars. Idlib has also been the site of numerous false flags, from what I can tell, and from what many of our guests have said, with good facts and argument. So yeah, I mean, I'm reporting this because it's coming out. I think that this is definitely part of the wider anti-Russian narrative. That this is just one little another chink of ammo they're trying to throw on that trench or whatever. But it's not good, frankly. And yeah, while the Western press reports this, they completely disregard evidence to the contrary. So anyway, that's that headline. Police in Thailand have arrested at least 20 after an emergency ban on gatherings. Police in Thailand dispersed a group of protesters who camped out overnight outside the office of the prime minister to demand his resignation. That led him to implement a severe state of emergency in the capital area. Police said they arrested more than 20 people for violating that state of emergency, although they have not been officially charged. Among them were protest leaders Arnan Nampa, Harit Chiwarak, and Prasidi Brudaharo Chana. Oh man, that's a hard one. Anyway, stumbling aside, next headline, Kyrgyzstan's president has announced his resignation. President Zhinbekov has resigned, and Sadir Japarov, who only days ago was behind bars serving a sentence for kidnapping a public official, has become the country's new head of government. This came as early last week, crowds stormed the parliament building. The country's prime minister and speaker of the parliament resigned. One person, that's a 19-year-old man, was actually killed amid clashes. Deputy Speaker of Parliament Mirlan Bakirov, a member of Magnier, Kyrgyzstan, a party connected with the Kyrgyz kingmaker Raimbek Matreimov, proposed Japarov for the role of prime minister. Masses of supporters began to rally around Japarov. Some were drawn by his nationalism and the promise to give back to the people the privatized gold mines, the, quote, stolen, end quote, national wealth. A Kyrgyz academic said, I'm quoting here, I think nobody can tell really how it's possible that Japarov jumped from a place of detention immediately to the highest echelons of power. Nobody can answer this question currently, and it's puzzling all of us. Was it an orchestrated plan by a group of people who wanted to take advantage of the revolt and advance their own interests, or was it a spontaneous act by Japarov's supporters? We don't know, end quote. However, he does have a bunch of support. He's very popular. So there's that does actually push people into those upper echelons of power, to use his phrase. But then there's also the question, is there something else at play? Are there other secret backers? I don't know. And I'm guessing you don't know, Jamarl, because Kyrgyzstan is pretty far away from either of our spheres of knowledge here. But interesting to watch. What's your take on what's going on?
It is interesting to watch. I have to be honest. I need to learn more about the Kyrgyzstan part. I do think it's interesting that all of these countries around or that used to be part of the Soviet Union are having these difficulties. But to be honest, you can make a case that we are too. You know what I mean? It's like the rest of the world is also.
Yeah.
So there's nothing specific or special about them in the sense that, everybody is having these difficulties. Yeah, I need to learn more about the Kyrgyzstan thing. I mean, it's one of those things that pops up. It's in the middle of nowhere. We have someone who I used to work with, who was there for a period of time, who lived there for a period of time. But even she was like, yeah, the political situation is beyond me. And so, yeah, this is something we're just going to have to bring a guest on or learn more about.
It'd be fantastic. Yeah, it'd be good to have that conversation. I'll put it like that. 2 more headlines here. I want to get through them. Japan will move all applications and filings from banks, insurance companies, and other financial institutions online. That'll come by the end of March 2020, according to Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga's push to digitize the government. Estonia, which is seen as a world leader in online governance, has also digitized almost all government forms, including those on financial matters. But Japan accepts most only on paper and during weekdays, limitations that have been both inefficient and costly. At the end of March 2019, Japan's Financial Services Agency required paper submissions for 1,612 of the 1,767 applications and filings under its purview. That meant an online option existed for only 8.8% of them. That's going to be a big deal for them. This is the kind of transition that a lot of countries, frankly, should be going through. And yet, of course, everybody's concern is not just with things like tampering, but also them getting hacked. Tampering from the inside, getting hacked from the outside, whatever way you're looking at it. If you create this system, an electronic system, a little miniature bureaucracy written up in code, that is inherently susceptible. And the scale of that susceptibility is, as far as I can tell, much larger than it is with paper. So there's this, what makes it inefficient to do by paper also might make it dangerous, frankly, to do digitally. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but if we're going to do it, you should do it well. That's my take. Jamarl, what's yours?
Code is fascinating. I used to be a software engineer, and it's a layer between reality, meaning that paper, even it slows reality down to some degree because the person has to read it, you have to take it out, you have to whatever. But from the standpoint of code, as an engineer, I always have the intermediary layer, and which always adds a susceptibility to tamper. I mean, So it's a win. It's like there's a positive and there's a negative to it. And this, man, if our society was as such, where we could just trust, it would be so much cheaper and so easier. Like it adds so much extra cash and money and time just to put in protections. So yeah.
It's true. No, I hear what you're saying. No, the whole security thing, it's an arms race. We should get somebody on to talk about this at some point. It's just a generally interesting conversation to have, a topic to talk about. Like the whole white hat, black hat, gray hat thing and all the shades in between and the hacker community and the ethics of hackers, the lack of ethics of hackers. It's just an interesting thing there. I used to be a web developer. I've done some light coding and stuff. One time I made a 3D model spin around on a web page as you scrolled down the web page. I was trying to get a job, and that was a fun thing to do. There's a lot of stuff out there. I guess what's held me back ultimately is I just don't want to live under a blue fluorescent light as I code in the middle of the night alone, sadly building something that only I can see. You know what I mean? It's lonely. And I guess if I were outside, if I could somehow code while I'm on a hike, you know what I mean? And I'm carefully watching my feet, but also tracking the lines of code. I don't know if I could do that practically, but that feels like the healthy way to do it. We need to get there. Anyway, last quick headline here. I want to wrap up. An unidentified person has been seen flying in a jetpack in the airspace near the Los Angeles International Airport again. The man was spotted by a flight crew. That came around 1:45 p.m. yesterday, local time. According to the FAA, quote, a China Airlines crew reported seeing what appeared to be someone in a jetpack at an approximate altitude of 6,000 feet, about 7 miles northwest of Los Angeles International Airport, end quote. The FAA alerted local law enforcement agencies and said that they are investigating the report. It's the second time That's I envy that person. And I just, you know what? I'm going to close out the headlines here. You've listened to Headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There we go. I know that's a little bit strange, but I just really wanted to say this. They're assuming that the person was a man. In the headlines that I'm seeing, it's like they're all like second-time man in jetpack has been spotted over LAX. And I understand why they're doing that. But I just have flashbacks to Metroid Prime, where at the end of playing, and I actually never played through it, I hear you take off your helmet and you see that it's a woman. And that could be happening here. That could totally be the case. And it's this implicit sexism is disgusting, Jamarl. Anyway, we've got to go into a break. We'll be back on the other side of this break with your monologue. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
Hey, Jamarl.
We give you the most
Yes,
essential.
Yeah, I got the clips.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben.
Ukraine first, get 3 second.
Perfect.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of our station in DC. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, definitely give us a like and a share. If you guys want to join in on this conversation, send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Do not be shy. I don't bite, at the very least, not often. We need to do something and have an honest reconciliation with why we keep developing such problematic, bottom feeder, outright corrupt candidates. Right now, we have a race between Donald Trump, a man who I would say got over 200,000 people killed through incompetence, and people flagrantly say it's corrupt. And actually, it's going to have all sorts of bills coming due at the point of his presidency, including potentially arrested by a prosecutor that is going after him for some kind of tax nonsense. But Joe Biden. Right now, yesterday, Joe Biden got busted for something that people assumed that he was guilty of to some degree, because it would be weird if he wasn't guilty of it. And Joe Biden does have a history of having grifting family members that shred off his name. I mean, go back and look at the credit card stuff. But on this very specific instance, this has to do with Ukraine. Joe Biden, when asked about his dealings with the Ukraine and Hunter Biden's dealings with the Ukraine, Hunter, of course, crackhead, ends up somehow making $50,000 to $80,000 a month, depending on the source that you're looking at, and no experience in oil and gas, and no experience in the Ukraine. And yet, there he is. How does he do that? I know people, or one or two people who are crackheads, they would love to have that experience of making $50,000 to $80,000 a month, working in a company that they know nothing about, in a country they know nothing about. But they don't get those opportunities. So the question that people had is, why him? Why him? Why does that guy, Hunter Biden, get the opportunity of that gas company? Well, we get a little bit more information that just came out from a laptop that apparently was dragged out the water somewhere and left with a repairman and never picked back up. And apparently a Senate committee has that laptop and is looking at that laptop, and they have documents, like emails, like this one. The people, let's, right here. Dear Hunter, thank you for inviting me to DC and giving me the opportunity to meet your father and spend time together. It's really an honor and a pleasure. Why is this pleasant email discussing a pleasant meeting problematic for Joe Biden? And why does it meet the criteria that I'm saying bottom-feeding corrupt politicians? Because Joe Biden has continuously said that there was no connection between the two. In fact, two things. First, Joe Biden gets a Ukrainian prosecutor fired. Let's play that clip first, and so I can give a little bit of context to what I'm talking about. Let's play the clip.
I remember going over convincing our team, or others, to convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid at the time. Well, there's still, they made some.
Think about that. Joe Biden is in another country threatening to get the prosecutor of that other country fired. Now, the prosecutor of that country was going to investigate a company that was corrupt. Everybody considers it corrupt, viciously so. Somebody called it gothically corrupt, is one of my favorite examples. But Joe Biden got the prosecutor fired that was going to be looking into that company to which his son was getting $50,000 to $80,000 off. Now, Joe Biden said he never heard anything about this. He never talked to his son about Burisma. And yet you have this letter, this email connecting the two. That's a lie. Joe Biden just got caught in a lie. It gets worse because it's not just him having a conversation about meeting with a person from Burisma, somebody he said he never met with. It's also about influence, meaning the conversation in one of the emails gets into this notion of he needs advice on how to use his influence on the company's behalf. Now, keep in mind, at this point, Joe Biden is a viceroy of the Ukraine. You just heard him say he got a man fired who was part of the state apparatus, which gives you this notion of power that Joe Biden had, holding this $1 billion over their heads. It was a fledgling country that Joe Biden basically was in control of at that point. And his son was working at a company, and his son introduced them to members of that company, and you get to see that he at some point gets to meet some of the head people at that company and becomes on the board of that company within, I think it was maybe less than a year after he's on the board of that company where this guy gets fired, Shokin. This is the link. The connection is clear at this point. Joe Biden can't necessarily make the assertion that I had nothing to do or I knew nothing about my son's dealing with this. It's also understood that Obama had concerns about this. And so now you get these emails that come out showing that, yes, he knew about it. Yes, he was exerting influence. At the very least, he was being requested about exerting influence. And the enemies of the company, after the request, eventually was fired, with Joe Biden in that video bragging that he got the guy fired. I want you to hear something else, because Joe Biden has continuously said, I knew nothing about it, I knew nothing about it, I had nothing to do with it. Let's play it with him and Savannah Guthrie, because I want to make this clear that this is a lie, especially with the legitimacy of the emails. Let's play the clip.
Been back to Senate.
Has it occurred to you that there's a certain irony here that the president is accused of and has acknowledged wanting to get information about your son Hunter and his dealings with Ukraine, and this process of impeachment has ensured that everyone knows about Hunter's dealings with Ukraine?
That's a good thing, and no one's found anything wrong with his dealings with Ukraine except they say it sets a bad image.
Well, do you agree that it sets a bad image?
And my son said that.
Do you think it was wrong for him to take that position?
No.
knowing that it was really because that company wanted access to you.
Well, that's not true. You're saying things you do not know what you're talking about. No one said that. Who said that?
Well, the guy in the email said it. The guy in the email said it, Joe. That's who said it. Right here. Pulzlarski said that the representatives, new authorities in power, tend to be quite aggressive towards NZ unofficially with the aim to obtain cash from him. Meaning, they tried to shake down the owner of the company, and they requested Joe Biden's assistance. When the alleged shakedown failed, they proceeded to concrete actions in the form of one of the pretrial proceedings. He wrote, "We urgently need your advice on how you could influence to convey the message or signal to stop what we consider to be politically motivated actions," he added. My point is, they got a prosecutor fired. Joe Biden said he never knew anything about it or never talked to his kid about it. He did talk to his kid about it, and the people from the company sent an email attesting to such. Shane, this is a smoking gun. Now, Twitter and Facebook did not play this. They hid this. And they tried to avoid putting this out for people to read. But this is, damning, to put it mildly.
It's damning for them. I mean, didn't they broadcast? Did they try to suppress the New York Times when they came out with Trump's tax returns, knowing, of course, that those tax returns were not legally distributed? It's not like the New York. I'm not saying the New York Times is culpable, but the person who gave them those documents, I can only assume, broke a law. The same seems to be true here. Why did they suppress one and not the other? Why are they suppressing it when it's against Biden and not suppressing it when it's against Trump? You see what I'm saying?
I mean, no, good point. I mean, that brings up, when right wingers say, oh, they're suppressing us. And by the way, when Joe Biden responded to this, his response was, it wasn't on the agenda for the day, meaning it wasn't on the official agenda. Well, nobody said anything about the official agenda. Nobody said this was your
Who cares about
meeting.
the official agenda? Yeah,
right. It's
you
like
as a president are supposed to be able to deal with those circumstances. You're not going into a room, going into an interview. If the idea is that you're only going to answer questions you expect them to ask, then you're not presidential. You're not quick on your feet. You can't deal with yourself. You know what I mean? You need to be able to act from that sort of, not just that feeling or that sense of self-confidence, but from a genuine position of confidence in your position, in your affairs, in all this stuff. And the fact that that is the story that people would bring up with him. The truth is, he could have been prepared for it, even in the sense of having a better way to dismiss it. But the way that he dismissed it, I would want to hear the clip again, but it was unconvincing. And that's, if you're going to be evil about it, at least be a little bit more effective with it. You see what I'm saying, Jamarl?
Not just not convincing, almost sounds like a yes, like an agreement of almost. I mean, to basically say, I'm trying to get his exact quote, but they basically say it wasn't on his official schedule. Doesn't mean anything other than I didn't write it down. Like, I didn't write my corruption down. I was going, look, at least he had sense enough not to, so that's positive. But the idea, if Joe Biden would have never stood up on a stage and admitted to basically threatening a government official or getting a government official fired, bragging about it. And by the way, lying within the context of that bragging, because it wasn't within a few hours. It was like 6 months or something like that. It was stretched over a period of time. But still, they're getting him for something that they accused Trump of. And this is more egregious. If this turns out to look the way it looks, this is even more egregious. And saying that the meeting
looks the way it looks, man. It looks. But here's the thing. This is what my dad, God bless him, what he brought up when we had him on the show pretty recently. I believe it was last week. He said the real story here, and he's right, is the overthrow of their government, where we were in large part behind through online education programs, basically through civil society groups, and then through the State Department on the highest levels. We were behind the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Ukraine, and we chose it. Victoria Nuland, the former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, there's this kind of notorious call. Now, what most people heard about in that call, if they heard about it at all, was her saying F the EU. I'm not going to, of course, say the actual word. It's usually bleeped out when people play the clip, but that's what people hear about. But in that same call, she's talking about who they're going to choose for that government. So this story is ridiculous, and sure, it's going to affect our electoral cycle, hopefully at least. But the real story is that we overthrew the government. And those are our strong arm tactics. Biden should be held responsible, not just for Biden, but first and foremost for his role in that ongoing crisis that unfortunately continuously failed state. In any event, we've got to go into a break. We're going to come back in just a minute after these ads. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Stay tuned, folks.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars. Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate. No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary. I see what you did there. Yep. Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320. And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and our guest, Jim Jatras. He's a Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist. He's also an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia and Pennsylvania who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. Jim, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great. I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey, thank you so much for coming back. I really enjoyed our last conversation. I'm going to start it like this. I saw a tweet you posted recently about QAnon. I've got a question for you. Is the storm coming, or what are we? What should we be prepared for later this year, Jim? I joke, of course.
Well, I think there is a storm coming. I don't think the QAnon storm where somehow Trump in his 5D chess, cleans out the Augean stables of the U.S. government. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think we're in for a very difficult time in the fall where we end up with a very inconclusive result of the election, at least on election night, and set up for each side to accuse the other of stealing the election, and then many bad things can happen after that. But I don't think that's the storm that Q is talking about. I think Q is essentially some sort of disinformation scam from somebody, but I don't know from whom.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about exactly from whom that scam is coming. On that topic, on the sort of scary topic that you brought up, we wanted to get into here. I'm curious. I would trust your opinion more than mine on this one. I've heard people talking a lot of apocalyptic talk about what could be coming. But like you're saying, if there's an inconclusive election, which it seems there's going to be, this is coming, of course, with an inconclusively nominated Amy Coney Barrett going into the Supreme Court. So many people, even if the Supreme Court is the party here that is ultimately going to decide it, that might not be conclusive because there are arguments of political malfeasance going on by Democrats against Republicans. Where do you think this could go, Jim?
Well, to start with, if one or the other wins by a blowout, maybe that's a good thing because then at least it's harder for the other side to say the election is stolen. But if it's at all close, and if you have like a half dozen states that are where Florida was in the year 2000, you could end up in a situation where we don't know. And one thing you're hearing actually from both sides is the prospect of what they call the blue shift, where it looks on election night like maybe Trump won, but then over the weeks and months, you have more and more ballots being found and the Democrats then claiming victory. The Republicans will say the Democrats are now stealing the election after election night. The Republicans, the Democrats will say, no, Trump tried to steal it by declaring victory on election night when all the ballots had not been counted. And then the question is, what does each side do after that? And what do their supporters do on the street? Now, you hear sometimes from the Democrats, well, the right-wing militias, blah, 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 they're going to go do something. I don't think most of the people in, flyover country are going to go down the street and burn down the local post office. But I do think, based on what we've seen so far, if it looks like, quote, Trump is stealing the election, we are going to see more violence from the kind of people that have been rioting in some of the cities in recent months. So I think the prospect of violence is actually pretty significant.
But what happens from a governmental standpoint? I mean, it's fair to say that each side is going to give their 2 cents, but both of those parties are not appendages of the U.S. government. They're just, they have their own political distinction point of view, but the government is something else. It's like the driver of a bus versus the bus itself. The government would be the bus. What are the mechanisms of government itself that kick in a situation like that?
That's a very good question, especially since, and this has been my thesis all along, especially back to Q and 5D chess and all that nonsense, is that Trump really doesn't have much control over the apparatus of government as far as I can see. If you look at so much of what we're happening, it's coming from, whether you want to call it the permanent government, the deep state, the intelligence agencies, that they've always considered him kind of a foreign growth on the body politic, and that even his appointees, it seems, are more loyal to the institutions, the permanent institutions, than they are the fact that you have an elected president who constitutionally runs the executive branch of government. You look, for example, about how many people, and this maybe gets back to the Q thing, the storm is coming, Durham's report is coming, and all those guys who are responsible for FISA-gate are going to go to jail. No, they're not. Nothing like that's ever going to happen, I don't think. So I think that there's a very strong likelihood that the permanent apparatus of government will try to, I don't know. I think there is a bias against Trump in this, but I don't really know how that would play out.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, because at the end of the day, the government, despite the parties being their own thing, they are running the government at that point, and whatever they do is going to have a certain degree of power and of leverage within the political system itself.
Right. And let me add to that, if I can. I think this is mainly true with regard to the national security apparatus. I mean, when you see like hundreds of retired officials, especially military officials, diplomats, coming out in support of Biden, and then you have the so-called Transition Integrity Project, which openly talks about the military stepping in to remove Trump from office. It seems to me that's kind of evidence of that's the tip of the iceberg of an establishment that really doesn't want to see him reelected, whether he is or not. And I think, again, that's going to feed the narrative of his supporters that the thing was stolen. But I don't know how that plays out in real life, except that there'll be lawyers galore involved in the courts. And you're right, it may eventually end up at the Supreme Court.
I was watching one of the interesting things that came up recently. And again, this was on your Twitter feed, and I thought this was fascinating. And we keep hearing about this train or the light at the end of the tunnel. Is it a moving, is it a bus or is it a train? And I think we realize that, yeah, there's a bus coming, but it's one of those things that the bus is already here. Now, someone posted, but Los Angeles was outlawing racism or something to that effect. And I think the person responded kind of making the point like, this is a system in decline. Because you're basically putting up something entirely on somebody's thought process. Meaning you're thinking a particular way, and because you're thinking a particular way, I'm going to put you in prison. Not based on something you did, but how you were thinking. I mean, is this a system in decline? I mean, like you said, it just seems like they are putting everything against the wall to stop Trump from getting in office.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's bigger than just Trump. I mean, I think Trump is kind of a Rorschach blot for what you think America is. That if you think he's Orange Hitler, who represents everything evil about our country, and that he genocide and racism and slavery and all that stuff, then he's got to go. On the other hand, if you're people who think this is basically a good country with good values and so forth, and that it's some kind of a fake ersatz America that's trying to overthrow our historic identity, the conflict takes on, I think, very different contours if you look at it that way. So in a sense, it's not really about Trump or removing Trump, although superficially it is, because he's the guy who sort of symbolizes those two futures for America, one way or the other. And I think what you were saying earlier before I came on about Burisma and these emails and about Hunter Biden, and then we saw Twitter and Facebook and the tech giants trying to prevent people from sharing that information, that the idea of free speech as a fundamental value is something that doesn't really register with a lot of the the big corporations. And what I mentioned earlier about the so-called deep state. The big corporations, including the tech giants, the military-industrial complex, the Wall Street. In my mind, they all form a kind of a nomenclatura. Looks very similar to the old Soviet Union in many respects of privilege. It's a huge network of power that I think doesn't like the idea that the traditional freedoms, the traditional identity of America should continue as we've known it for over 200 years.
Well, it also seems to match actions over recent decades. It seems to match not just a shift. I mean, you're talking, I'm guessing, I'm actually curious. What is the cultural or political identity that you're assuming the deep state or members of the deep state are trying to promulgate through their actions? And, maybe if you can just set up a little bit more clearly, what's your definition? What's the contrast that you'd make between that and America as is, America as a fundamental political idea with some truth behind it in a Platonic sense? Jim, what's your take?
Well, I know this is very controversial, but I think that there's an ethnic content to it. I mean, what language are we speaking right now? We're speaking English, right? The American founders were basically Englishmen, and they had hundreds of years of their English experience behind them. They'd separated from the crown. They set up their own operation here and so forth. But America's it wouldn't be the same country if it were founded by, say, Spaniards or Frenchmen or Chinese or Jews or Greeks or Poles. And that was the identity that people assimilated to. That's why we have the kind of freedoms, the rights of Englishmen traditionally are called enshrined in our Constitution. If you try to shift America over into kind of a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multisexual, multilinguistic country that has no center of gravity, no real identity except maybe the marketplace, whatever the big corporations want, I think that's a very different concept, and I think that's the one we're shifting over to. And I think, again, picking up on before I came on, this relates directly to this notion of we are the world state. We have the right to overthrow governments anywhere in the world. We're kind of like a new Soviet Union armed with a woke ideology that we can impose on the rest of the world, and that we proceeded to do in the last few decades, especially after our great adversary of the 20th century, the Soviet Union, was eliminated. So I think there is this kind of, I don't know what you would call it, this invade the world, invite the world mentality that the establishment has that really doesn't have any place for the old stick in the mud America that they would like to remove.
That's interesting. I'm interested that you said that. Do you think that either government, meaning any of the governments, whether it was the Soviet Union or the United States, that if the United States had basically, let's say it this way, if the contest between the superpowers didn't end up in the way that it ended up, with just one seeming to basically win and to exceed beyond it, that America would not have ended up this way, meaning it's the power balance that allows a certain degree of, justice or equity within the world. And the moment that the power balance goes away, well, that one country at that point goes rogue. Do you think it's the power balance itself or the distribution of power that allows the world to remain almost on balance?
I think it's largely the power balance, and I think what we've seen since the Soviet. And look, I was no fan of communism or necessarily the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact, but there was something remarkably stable about it in terms of restraining one of the other powers' behavior. When you eliminate that, and the other power says, "Great, I can now pursue global domination," which is what we've done. I remember that Bill Kristol and Bob Kagan in 1996 called for benevolent global hegemony. That's the role the United States should play. And if the Russians and Chinese are offended, well, we should take that as a compliment. And I think we've seen that in U.S. behavior, not only with regard to these regime changes by color revolutions, but also in wars. Libya, Syria, the bombing campaign against Serbia in 1999, and also what we're seeing now, pressing the Russians and Chinese on every front, whether it's in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, or with regard to Russia, the Black Sea, the Baltic, Eastern Europe, Belarus. I think we're much closer. That a lot of people might fear that to a potential great power conflict, because the kinds of restraints we saw during the first Cold War simply don't exist now. And of course, we're systematically destroying all the arms control and other treaties that restrain behavior of the United States. And I don't think most Americans realize what kind of peril these people are pushing us into.
Jim, let's take a break here. I'm glad this is a fascinating topic, and I'm glad we're in this way. So this is James. The voice that you've been listening to is James George Jatras, Washington, D.C. government and media relations specialist. He's also an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia in Pennsylvania, who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines.
And we're back.
Oh, go ahead, Shane. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. You know what? Sure. And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined by Jim Jatras. He's a Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist, also an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia and Pennsylvania, who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. Actually, Jim, I'm just curious if you're able and willing to talk about this with us. No pressure. What was the story about your appearance before the Supreme Court?
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because it's there's two ways you can feel. When we talk about appearing before the court, most people think in terms of oral argument. No, I've never done that. I've appeared in writing. I've filed briefs before the Supreme Court. So I just want to clarify that for people. I think I'm glad you gave me the opportunity. Actually, I was the counsel of record for filing the brief in the 1988 Webster case on abortion on behalf of the Holy Orthodox Church. So the Orthodox Church in the United States, the Russian, the Greek, and the other jurisdictions filed a brief in support of the government. I think which state it was, Kansas, in an abortion case. So we called for Roe to be overturned, which I guess maybe is relevant to what's going on in the Senate right now with the Amy Coney Barrett nomination.
So, do you believe that she should be asked about religious beliefs? I mean, that's been one of the big topics. I've always made the argument you don't need her to have explicit conversations with people. Those people are choosing you because they already know where you fall on those issues. So how do you see this? Do you think that, yes, they should be able to answer questions on issues of faith and those type of things, or that should be off the table and she should answer when it comes up in a case?
I don't think they should ask somebody about the religion. There is a specific prohibition on a religious test for public office in the Constitution. I think what's a little bit maddening about the hearings is she's clearly trying to answer on the question of what a judge should do. The judge's job is not to say what the law should be. It is to say what the law is based on what has been enacted by the legislature. I mean, for example, when the Democratic side kept trotting out this person or that person who would be hurt if the Affordable Care Act is struck down, and you're trying to steal health insurance from this person? Well, wait a minute. It's not her job to enact the law, and if the law is badly drafted or if it's unconstitutional for some other reason, or for that matter, if it passes judicial review, that's what a judge is supposed to do, not say, is this a good thing or a bad thing, or do I want to hurt this person or hurt that person? And again, maybe I'm revealing my biases here.
No, I agree with you.
When we talk about judicial activism, the people on the left, judges, say, I want to enact this right because I think it's a good thing. I'll find it in the Constitution, whether it's there or not.
I agree with you only to a point, though. I mean, there is a subjective element to the reading of the law, and that subjective element comes into play on whether or not they deem something appropriate or not appropriate. The law is language. Language is always fickle and slippery in regards to the reading of it, and so you always have this kind of human element that gets into it that makes an assertion one way or the other in regards to their thoughts. But I agree with you though. If she could have got on that bench and said, I'm going to take down Roe v. Wade. If Trump finishes in the election and it comes to the Supreme Court, I am going to make a vote so Trump can pass. And even going further, they can even go further and say, and I'm going to take down Obamacare. It doesn't matter. They choose, like her job, like you said, is to interpret the law. She's going to interpret it the way she interprets it. Congress is going to either pass her or not. And she could say all of that stuff. Congress could still pass her, and the president could still, gets his pick. I guess I'm agreeing with you. It doesn't really matter if she's against or for those things.
Let me pick up on that. Let me pick up on it briefly if I can, because one of the sort of the ghosts in the room really is of course about Roe, and that is because even if you're 100% for the legality of abortion, nobody. I don't know how many people have actually sat down and read that decision. It's an embarrassment. I mean, a high school paper, you'd be ashamed to hand that into your teacher in terms of any kind of legal reasoning. They clearly simply wanted to reach the result they did and came up with a justification to do it. Everybody knows this. Everybody on both sides know that Roe is a lousy decision as a matter of law. Even so, even if she's confirmed, I don't think Roe's going to be struck down, because I think even a majority of the court on the so-called conservative side is going to say, but we have to worry about the integrity of the institution and not have these sudden shifts where we overturn a longstanding precedent. They're more worried about that than the fact that they've got a longstanding decision in front of the court that's simply an embarrassment to everybody involved.
Interesting take. Firebrand take there, Jim.
That's a firebrand take.
Very, very good to hear from you in a way. Here's where I would go with this, though. If nothing is going to actually come of that, and I kind of want to go back to something else we were talking about in the last segment, actually, because it ties in. Jamarl had asked a question. He was describing the sort of the lack of control that the parties have over the government. I don't want to misrepresent there, but there's this detachment. What can Trump actually do? What can the Democrat or the Republican parties actually do? There's no legitimacy of force. There shouldn't be. There's no way for them to strong arm the government at this point, at least not on the surface level. The weird thing here is that on the back end, they have a lot of, if not the same exact funders, they have a lot of the same sort of goals in mind in terms of broadly pushing for more wars, broadly trying to represent a small class of business interests. Now, the business interests might be different for each party, but they're each sort of equally corrupt. Why is 2020? You were saying earlier that Trump is, I don't want to misrepresent, but something like a weather vane, or that he represents an alternative political order and maybe a return to a former political order, and that the establishment, quote unquote, the deep state, whatever terms you want to use, is doing everything they can to push against him. It seems to me like politics is so constrained, like Trump has been so constrained. I find myself asking, what can he actually do? But then the question there is, why are they trying so damn hard to stop him? And that also ties in with the Supreme Court. Jim, if she's not going to be the domino that or the extra weight on one side of the scales that manages to overturn Roe v. Wade, that's not plausible or feasible, if it's not likely to happen, why all the noise and why all the outcry? And the same also applies to the election. Jim, what's your take?
Yeah, well, look, as I say, I don't think that's likely to happen. I think it could happen, but I don't think it's likely. And I put it in the context of what we've seen where in foreign policy, where Trump, he said he wanted to get along with Russia and China and get out of these wars in 2016. And of course, he hasn't delivered on that. I think he wants to. How many times has he ordered our troops out of Syria? And it simply hasn't happened. When we look at getting to the bottom of FISA-gate, as I mentioned earlier, where is Durham? Why are they not doing that? Why is not Barr doing something about it? I guess the sense I have is that Trump is relatively powerless as president. Even if he gets elected, I think we're just going to have 4 more years of drama. The natural tendency is going to be exactly where you mentioned, that all the big funders, all the big donors, they're much more comfortable with the trajectory of policy as it's been going for many years now, which is in the direction of more and more global domination, less and less freedom in the United States, and more of a departure from our historic identity. The reason they hate Trump is not because of anything he's done, but because I think he's like a specter or a fear that somehow that all gets undone, that trajectory can be changed. Even though he has not yet been able to do it, the fear is lurking that he somehow could, that he represents this sleeping giant out there in flyover country that could restore something like the older America, that, one nation under God, that sort of thing, that we've gotten away from in recent decades. So I think it's less, you asked the question, what can they do? I don't think that even the people trying to consolidate this new, if you will, woke order know what he could do to undo that, but they fear that he might somehow.
But you think he may undo it. Or I always think it to be that Trump was the flaming face with the mask off, and that it was one of those things that is so provocative in the way that he goes. He's too honest. When he says, yeah, Obama, was in a regime change war where he got 500,000 people killed. Well, that's honest in a way that's too honest. Like, it's not, I've said Donald Trump lies as easily as he breathes, but every so often he says something that no one ever says. And that's one of those things that no one ever says. No one ever accuses the previous president of breaking the law in that way. Do you think that has merit? Like, that it's not so much that he's going to undo it in any particular way. It's more so that the honesty of the way he acts, the grossness and over-the-topness, the appalling way in which he focuses on the economy as opposed to, while people are dying, those type of things, that it's too much and that they consider it too much. And so it's like, we need to pull him back. We can't have that. So somebody like a Biden or somebody like a Jeb Bush or Mike Pence would be perfect. But Donald Trump is too honest in the way that he goes for very specific policies.
Exactly right. I think that to date myself here, he's kind of like a big orange Archie Bunker in a way. He channels the ordinary guy in flyover country in a way that the establishment doesn't like very much. When he went in front of the audience in South Carolina in 2016 during the primaries and denounced the Iraq War in one of the most pro-military states in the country, and people loved it. It didn't kill him with the Republican voters, although the establishment was terrified by that. So I think you're right that he channels this voice of the forgotten man in flyover country, or a woman in flyover country, that don't like the direction the country's been going. They don't necessarily fully understand what all is wrong with the system, but they know this guy gives voice to the stuff that they think is wrong, and that's where the establishment is worried about him. But he keeps coming back to the fact he hasn't been able to do much about it. I don't think he'll be able to do much about it even in a second term, and that my fear is one way or the other we'll get exactly what you just said. We'll get some kind of a nice, comfortable, vanilla Jeb Bush type character, either on the Republican side or more likely at that point on the Democratic side, who will be completely copacetic with the way our country has been moving in the last few decades, including in the direction of global empire.
That is unfortunate.
I think that what's scariest about that is just that there's no actual hope for improvement there. It's comfortable, it's warming. It's like as a phrase from Eric Weinstein, the long nap. We're in this long 75-year nap since 1945 or 1950, thereabouts. And the idea is we just keep hitting the snooze button. We just keep, every 4 years, we elect somebody into office, and sometimes it's a little bit nightmarish, sometimes it's a pleasant dream, but we keep delaying, any real restoration of not only the American economy, but the American culture, any real deeper resolution of our problems. Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
For those listening, that was the voice of James George Jatras. He's a Washington, D.C. based government and media relations specialist, also an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia and Pennsylvania, who has appeared, we were talking about this earlier, appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court, previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. By the way, follow him on Twitter at Jim Jatras. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Trying to levitate the Pentagon from across the country, I am your independent political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
I don't think that's going all that well, but I'm going to be optimistic. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, I don't want to be pessimistic about that, so keep trying it, man.
Someday it'll happen, Jamarl.
right.
I will be able to
like, oh my God.
Join me.
That's
the
day
trick.
The aliens attack, right?
We all do it.
Yeah, it's 2020, so who knows? So let's get to the headlines. In the news, Republican chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Lindsey Graham, sang the praises of Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett in the third day of hearings for the nomination, saying that, quote, "This is the first time in American history that we've nominated a woman who's unashamedly pro-life," unquote. His remarks cut into the concerns of many who are wary of an avowed conservative Supreme Court. Barrett is widely expected to be nominated by the Republican-led Senate at the end of the month, unless something strange happens. Yes. And, the pro-life thing. Look, what people need to reconcile themselves with is that regardless of the position of the justice and the person who's coming down the pike, the Constitution's thing is the president gets a choice, Senate confirms. That's it. Now, there may be other parts to that, but at the end of the day, whatever her choice is in regards to the way she would go with policy is her choice. And that can't necessarily have impact on the hearing, especially if these guys are Republicans and they like her choice. Does that make sense, Shane? It's not so much that I love the fact that this woman is being confirmed. Anybody that Trump chooses would be an ogre from my standpoint. But the thing is, Trump gets his choice, just like Obama got his choice, just like Clinton got his choice, just like Bush gets his choice. And you may not like that choice, but it is what it is, what it is. I mean, like all the consternation and everything else, I get it, but that can't matter.
There's that quote that I'm not even gonna try to quote it correctly. I'll just paraphrase it briefly. It's, good men don't need laws, and for bad men, laws won't work, that kind of a thing. I mean, the idea there being, if you have an ethical society, in this case, if you have a political system that's not completely polarized, where people are screaming at each other, and they're, instead of being distracted by long-term interests that are in the benefit of the country, they're distracted by their own short-term, selfish, personal interests. If you had a political system that weren't like that, one which were a little bit more ethical, then frankly, this mechanism would work. There would be some that's at least a hope, is that there'd be something reasonable beneath it. But as it is, you can change the mechanism if we put more Supreme Court justices in, and if we go through justice inflation, whatever that looks like. Not saying that that's going to happen. Biden's already rejected it. It's not going to get any better because functionally the people in charge are acting unethically. They're, whether that's incentive or just their inclination, there's no real way to tease that apart. It's probably both. Whatever the case, it's bad.
Well,
anyway, that's my.
The thing is, though, any system that doesn't take into account what's going to be using, meaning if I have a function, let's say if I'm writing software, and I have this massive class, and the class requires 3 items: a dog, a cat, and a mouse. Anything else, it blows up. Well, then the system doesn't work. Like it's one of those things where your system has to take into account who's going to be moving through and utilizing that system. And in this case, it's human beings. And if your system has any kind of thing in it that incentivizes bad behavior because they get some advantage in bad behavior, then we're going to get bad behavior. That's the only thing, right?
Yeah.
It's the system has to work. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Obviously, let's keep.
Well, and in this case, I would argue it only takes 2 entities. It only takes the Republicans and the Democrats, and those are two. It's like this weird horseshoe thing. The horseshoe theory. Usually, people will use this to refer to like the extreme fringes, the really hard left and the really hard right, miraculously and somewhat infamously coming together and agreeing on some stuff. Right. In a weird way, we're kind of dealing, with that with the Democrat and the Republican parties. Yeah. They superficially disagree on a lot of things, but functionally, they're being funded by the same entities. We had this conversation with Garland yesterday, being funded by the same people, and yet they're arguing like with all the clamor of iron, all the clamor of a horseshoe, striking another horseshoe. It's vicious. But what are they actually arguing about? I mean, I think to Jim's point, what they're arguing about is Trump, who is this one exception to that party caste system, that party status quo dichotomy spectrum thing that we have. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's actually, that is what's going on. And I'm saying that as somebody who doesn't like Trump personally and I'm not planning on voting for him. I'm not planning on voting for either of them.
It's like the Ross Perot thing. It's a third party person that makes it clear that it is possible to have somebody else, which of course is the most terrifying thing in the world to a 2-party system that is able to just go back and forth and have their advantage because of such. But let's keep going. So President Trump and Joe Biden will hold competing town halls tonight. You heard that right. Now this is because the second debate has been canceled. Donald Trump had COVID-19. Joe Biden didn't want to catch it. Of course, there was also the issues with the moderators. Basically, the debate commission wanted to have a virtual debate. Trump did not want to have a virtual debate. He wanted to be in-house, and it all broke down. So they're not going to have a debate. They're going to have competing town halls. This is, going to take place tonight, and the debate is going to follow. Trump last night held a rally in Iowa where he reportedly is in a dead heat with Joe Biden. Biden's town hall will be broadcast on ABC while Trump's will be held on NBC. We discussed earlier about the backlash for that. It's really strange, but there was a backlash going on with people basically saying boycott NBC because Donald Trump is going to be doing his town hall on NBC. Sad. So sad. And Shane, this goes to even the Twitter issue where they're like not wanting the Joe Biden thing to be on Twitter, the New York Post, like hiding that, or Facebook getting rid of it. It's a certain degree of censorship where these guys are actively saying, we don't want the president of the United States on our channel. Well, why not? If he says something that you don't particularly like, is not your person on your channel going to be more likely to challenge him than somebody on somebody else's channel? I find this to be weird. What do you think about this?
For some reason, I'm going to be a little bit controversial, but I want to go back to the statue thing. Remember a couple of months ago, we were going back and forth on the different elements of statues being torn down. Remember what I'm talking about?
No, I remember. The Columbus statues were being ripped down all over the place.
Exactly. Yeah. And a bunch of statues were being ripped down. In a weird way, and I don't want to make too much out of this, but that's a form of political censorship. That's a form of suppression of speech. That's a form of specifically trying to sort of rewrite history in these common spaces, these spaces that are taken as common. I mean, I guess here's what I'm saying. If you're going to be against this, I feel like you should be against that, because for me, they're a part of the same system. It's like, if you view Trump as genuinely a bad person, if you view Columbus as genuinely a bad person, and you want to sort of eradicate them from the social space in order to clear the way for some, greater, nobler new order or whatever, if that's your system, if you functionally view that as acceptable morally, then what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Again, I'm not trying to be controversial here, but I guess my point is I see them as the same thing. And if we're going to indict this, I feel like we should be indicting all of that stuff. What's your take on that?
I don't see them as the same thing. I see them as different. I mean, the Columbus statue, you can make a case, is a rewrite in and of itself. I mean, what is the statement that the Columbus statue is supposed to be making? I mean, this goes to the other statues like you were talking about. They were in the South, they were being pulled down. The flags, the Confederate monuments, all of those things were rewrites of history. I don't see these things as the same. MSNBC is an active network that is literally a news network. And the President of the United States, who, if he even breaks wind, is considered news, is going to be there and available for debate. I don't see the similarities between the two. But I think I know where you're trying to get to, but I don't think they're the same. But I feel you. I do feel you.
Yeah.
I do feel you. Let's keep going. In a 167-page report released on Thursday, Human Rights Watch said that attacks on civilian infrastructure in Idlib by the Syrian and Russian government between April 2019 and March 2020 violated international law. I do not trust the Human Rights Watch on the story. This is a shame. From what I've seen, supposedly, quote-unquote, independent humanitarian organizations have often acted as gloves for pursuing Western interests in regime change wars. Idlib has also been the site of numerous false flags, from what I can tell, and from what many of our guests have said with good factual arguments. I agree with Shane on this. Police in Thailand have dispersed a group of protesters who camped out overnight outside the office of the Prime Minister to demand resignation, leading him to implement a severe state of emergency in the capital area. Police said they arrested more than 20 people for violating state of emergency laws. They have also not officially charged anyone. Right, they have not been officially charged. Among them were protest leaders Arnan Nampa, Parrot, quote-unquote, the Penguin, Chirawak, and Prasidi Gurudurachurwana. I apologize for the rough pronunciation of the last one, but that is a difficult name.
That's a really hard name to pronounce.
Yeah, that's a rough
to your
name.
Benefit. I mean, that is a rough name to pronounce.
The closest thing I've seen to something like that is Iceland. We're in Iceland, and it would have like these, like 30-word or 30-letter names of volcanoes and whatnot. And that might be the closest thing to it. But yeah, that one's a toughie. Kyrgyzstan's president, Jeanbek, has resigned, and Syria Jamarl, whose only days ago was behind bars serving a sentence for kidnapping a public official, has become the country's new head of government. Wow. Early last week, crowds stormed the parliament building. The country's prime minister and speaker of the parliament resigned. One person, 19-year-old man, was killed amid clashes. Deputy Speaker of Parliament, Marlin Bakarov, a member of Mykonin, Kyrgyzstan, a party connected with with Kyrgyz kingmaker, Recep Metrikov, proposed Japarov for the role of prime minister. Masses of supporters began to rally around Japarov. Some were drawn by his nationalism and promised to give back the people, privatize gold mines, the quote-unquote stolen national wealth. I think nobody can tell, really, how it's possible that Japarov jumped from a place of detention immediately to the highest echelon of power. Nobody can answer this question currently, and it's puzzling to us, said Asil Dutlekiyev, a Kyrgyz academic. Was it an orchestrated plan by a group of people who wanted to take advantage of the revolt and advance their own interests, or was it a spontaneous act by Japarov supporters? We don't know. End of quote. Japan will move applications and filings from banks, insurance companies, and other financial institutions online by the end of March 2022 under Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga's push to digitize the government. Estonia, seen as a world leader of online governance, also has digitized almost all government forms, including those of financial matters. But Japan's accepts most only on paper, and during weekdays, limitations have been both inefficient and costly. As the end of March 2019, Japan's Financial Services Agency required paper submissions for 1,612 of the 1,767 applications and filings under its purview. This meant an online option existed only for 8.8% of them. Wow. I'm going to leave this here. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. That's pretty wild. Only 8.8% of their forms existed online. Huh. I remember when they made the push to change medical forms over and basically saying it's inefficient to have your doctor have to write up a different form that another doctor has to write up, that another doctor has to write up, and all of these doctors need basically the same information. That was a good thing that happened under the Obama administration, trying to basically digitize those processes. But let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Andre.
Fault Lines. Want to talk?
Sorry, I was talking on the phone with the guest.
And pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of our station from Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and share that video. If you want to join the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. But right now, a guest that I greatly love bringing on to the show, Tom Whitmore. Tom Whitmore is a former financial analyst and currently a senior board member of MUFON, of course, Mutual UFO Network, a U.S.-based nonprofit organization composed of civilian volunteers who study reported U.S. UFO sightings. It's one of the oldest and largest organizations of its kind, claiming more than 4,000 members worldwide. Tom, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Jamarl and Shane. Thank you for having me on your show.
Absolutely. So, Huffington Post comes out with an article, and it basically makes a point that Harry Reid confirms federal government covered up UFOs for years. Now, people like you and me say no kidding, because I've been following this for a very, very long time, and I'm sure, I know you have, and you've been following this longer than I have. One of the stories that they came out with had to do with the shutting down of military missiles. Now, this story had been recounted once before by military officers. And Harry Reid, so hearing it come out of Harry Reid's mouth was like, my ears perked up. Do you remember this story? Do you know what the story is? Basically, that there was a UFO hovering over a missile plant, missile silos, and one of the soldiers outside is losing his mind, like he's freaking out, and he's screaming at one of the guys, saying, "Hey, there's a craft out here. There's a craft out here," and the missiles start shutting down. Are you aware of the story?
Oh yes, and that story has actually been public, I think, since the 1990s. There was a book that came out by some UFO researchers that had been able to retrieve documents through the Freedom of Information Act. And these documents did allude to these incidents, mostly in the northern tier of the country, in which there were incidents in which alleged UFOs were hovering or had entered the area of the missile silos and apparently messed around with the control systems. And it's been documented much more extensively by testimony of people involved in a book called UFOs and Nukes.
To be clear, these missiles were not connected to one another, meaning the mechanisms of shutdown is still unclear. Like, it's not a situation where all of these things were connected. They're unconnected because they want to, just in case one goes down, the other one has to perform. And so having several of them go down in that way was shocking, to put it mildly. I think this is why people like Harry Reid and some of the Congress have jumped on this issue. Like Rand Paul, sent Harry Reid a thing saying, why didn't you tell me anything about the aliens, Harry? That type of stuff. But basically, whether these things are hostile or not, I suspect they're not. But whether they are or not, you have people who are in our government who see stuff like that and get terrified and want more information on it. Some people say they're demons. Other people say, they're not. They're just people kind of like us. Do you think Congress is going to have hearings on this? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, they're supposed to. But do you think they're going to have hearings? And what do you think the impact of those hearings are going to be from the standpoint of the American populace?
I think that it's possible that there could be some hearings. Now, the Senate Intelligence Committee under Marco Rubio have tried to set up a 6-month reporting system from DOD. And assuming that such a report or reports are submitted to the Senate Intelligence Committee, then I would think they would have a hearing. How much of it is public, I don't know, because it depends on how much of the information that DOD relays back is classified. And now we are facing a kind of an unsettled political situation. So if there's a dispute about the outcome of the election, then that may have an effect on what hearings are held when, if at all.
From in any time in your lifetime, have you seen a moment like this, where this much interest, this much, I guess you can say, the legitimacy of it? Like they said, it's confirmation, it's not disclosure. Donald Trump didn't come out with an alien and say, here's the ship out back, I'm going to get a beer. But you do have the U.S. military, in many respects, giving confirmational signals in regards to the organizations to which they're working with, meaning to the Stars Academy, and the Pentagon coming out saying, yeah, these are our videos. This is real. I'm always stunned by this because it seems like there's a back and forth in regards to, let's say, intelligence and whether this comes out or not. And there seems to be people who are for it and against it coming out in the back end, meaning behind the scenes, there seems to be this kind of push and pull in regards to the way that information is coming out. Why do you think that is? I mean, do you think it's just one of those things where some people don't believe that the public can reconcile themselves with the information? Do you believe it's just some kind of top secret stuff in the back end? Why do you believe this information is coming out now as opposed to coming out, like 20, 30 years ago?
Well, first of all, there was a great deal of public attention paid to the UFO problem in the 50s and 60s. And the Air Force was mainly involved on the public side of it. And they got thoroughly sick of the whole situation and got out of the public communication of UFO of the UFO problem. Now, what's been happening recently, I believe, is largely because of the efforts of Christopher Mellon and Luis Elizondo. And Luis Elizondo was in DOD, and he was running the so-called ATIP UFO program. But Christopher Mellon was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, may have gotten that backwards. But he was pretty high up in the Department of Defense. And I think that Christopher Mellon understands the levers of power, so to speak, over there. And he knows which levers to pull and which buttons to push and who to talk to. And he knows how to navigate through the system. Now, getting public information out of the Department of Defense regarding UFOs is like pulling teeth. It just doesn't come out unless you force it. And I think that is what has been going on.
Part of this, though, is the way they hide the information. Like, that's why it's pulling teeth. I mean, like the ATIP program was basically held in another company, or much of the information was held in the company because it was a private entity that was doing a lot of the research. And so you found, hey, you have these government, and maybe you can you explain it? These special access projects where you have government working along with a private company, and because the company has a lot of the information, a Freedom of Information Act doesn't really give you any data on it because it's actually held within the company itself. This is a way that the governments have been using to basically hide information that they don't necessarily want the public to know about advancement. Did I get that right? And could you elaborate on that?
Yes, that's partly true or largely true with a lot of so-called special access programs. And I think in the case of ATIP, and you're referring to the involvement of Robert Bigelow and his NIDS or BASS group creating a report for the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, the other side of it is it may have been set up in such a way that it wasn't transparent because the Defense Intelligence Agency and the elements in the Pentagon didn't want to be embarrassed by being involved in the UFO program. And I think that so much of this, Jamarl, is related to avoiding embarrassment because there is a very large segment, both of the public and the scientific community and the media and in the Department of Defense that are embarrassed by the UFO subject, and they just don't want it known that they're involved in it.
I understand the embarrassment.
Thank you so much for being with us. I can understand the embarrassment too. I'm kind of curious. I want to know, where did this start? I mean, the term conspiracy theory, as far as I know, was invented by the CIA to deride "quote unquote" conspiracy theories. I'm not trying to tie them in too closely here, but that's a sort of a natural analog or a natural parallel to it. The embarrassment, the idea that certain theories that might be a threat to elements of the government, or frankly, elements of any powerful organization, those theories are going to be derided and through that process denied and ignored. We only have about 2 minutes left, and I'd love to get you back on some other time. What's particularly interesting to me, and I want to hear you talk about it a bit, you're talking about back in the 50s, there was an era where we were hearing a lot about this stuff, hearing a lot about UFOs. There was an era of public investigation into this. This is not something I know about. Can you briefly set that up for us, and maybe we can come back to that in a future appearance? Tom?
Well, the conventional wisdom is that the modern UFO era began in 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold sighting. And interestingly, the Kenneth Arnold sighting, using modern terminology, went viral on the media. And the public was very much aware of the UFO or flying saucer phenomenon at that time. At the same time, there was a very large amount of activity going on all over the country with flying saucers or UFOs. And certain people were big proponents of the mystery, namely Donald Kehoe, who was a real gadfly to the UFO, to the Department of Defense and to the Air Force, and was constantly bugging them and accusing them of censorship. He even referred to a group that he referred to as the Silence Group. And this played a part in developing this idea that there's a conspiracy of silence within the Air Force and within the Department of Defense. And there were periodic UFO flaps, across the country during the 50s and 60s. But this all culminated with the Air Force hiring the University of Colorado under Dr. Edward Condon to do a study, and it was preordained that the study would find that there is basically nothing to the UFO problem, which gave the Air Force an excuse to get out of the public side of the UFO problem. And I think the media took a cue after that, and there is something amounting to what we in the UFO field feel was a media blackout in the 80s and 90s. That's starting to change now. How did it come about? Partly because of Tom DeLonge, the rock star. He's well known, and he got connected with some of these other people that can be helpful, like Luis Elizondo and Christopher Mellon and others. Now, how they came to be connected, I can't really tell you. I don't know the details in that.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us. We've got to wrap it there. Fascinating topic. That was a lightning fast overview, and I know that there's a lot more in between those bookends. For those listening, Tom Whitmore is a former financial analyst and currently a senior board member of MUFON. That's the Mutual UFO Network. That is a U.S.-based nonprofit organization composed of civilian volunteers who study reported UFO sightings. By the way, you can follow Tom on Twitter at Tom Tulsa. Also check out his blog, tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com, and follow MUFON on Twitter at MUFON, just MUFON. That's their handle. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are currently joined by our guest for this segment and the next, Elijah Magnier. He's a veteran war correspondent, and he writes at elijahjm.wordpress.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at EJMAllRai. That's EJMALRAI. Go check him out now if you're on your computer. Elijah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Here's what we brought you on to talk about. Lebanon and Israel are currently negotiating. This comes after decades of conflict. I want to ask you in the simplest terms, why are they negotiating? What's this about? Can you take us back sort of foundationally to the history of this conflict? What are they actually, what is the conflict over? And what are, through that understanding, what are the negotiations bringing to the table? What are they debating here? What is the process, Elijah?
Well, actually, there is an indirect negotiation between Lebanon and Israel because the two countries are considered enemy. This is why the United Nations and the Americans are acting as a go-between, where they sit in the same room, but they don't talk to each other. They talk to the mediator, who is a UN officer, who convey the same message to one group and then the other. And what they are negotiating about, they're negotiating about the final maritime borders that are disputed between Lebanon and Israel, where Lebanon, according to the United Nations old map since 1948 armistice agreement, they show that there are 863 square kilometers disputed between the two countries, between Lebanon and Israel. And the dispute is about who's going to control the 863 square kilometers, because they are extremely rich in oil and gas, and particularly gas. And what the Americans have tried to do in the past is to negotiate a way where they give Lebanon 500 square kilometers of its own maritime borders and give away to the Israelis 363. And Lebanon, of course, rejected this offer. And the Israelis are saying, well, the borders are very fluid, and the Anglo-French agreement that was agreed in 1949, according to the demarcation line at that time, consisted on 1/100,000 on the scale of the map, and on the French-English military map, which is not very accurate, while Lebanon is saying, no, the map is extremely accurate, the borders are very well defined, and we want our borders to be drawn according to these maps. And what the Israelis did is, through the support of the Americans, they have drawn what is called the blue line, which is on land between Lebanon and Israel. And they considered this the withdrawal line because the Israelis were occupying Lebanon, and they withdrew from Lebanon in the year 2000, keeping several villages under their control. And they are again a source of dispute between Lebanon and Israel. To go back to the blue line, why it is important? The blue line actually is a withdrawal line, but it's not the final line, because Lebanon disagree on this line, but they accepted the status quo to continue in the negotiation. And Lebanon and Israel are negotiating since 1996 on the bordering city of Nakura on the Lebanese borders to discuss with the Israelis indirectly about ending this problem and drawing the demarcation line. And Lebanon is insisting on drawing the land line first, and according to the land line, the maritime line can be drawn.
Has this back and forth, is Lebanon able to maintain their station in this? I mean, a lot of this has to do with power in regards to negotiation, wars, basically negotiation by other means. Do they have the military might, let's call it that, in order to have these negotiations where they're just not pushed or overwhelmed? And for that matter, why did Israel leave that area in 2000?
Well, that's an excellent question. First of all, Lebanon as a country has the power. If we look at the ministerial communique, that is saying Lebanon, that is the army, the people, and the resistance. So if we put all three together, then we're putting Hezbollah as a resistant group supporting the Lebanese government. And Hezbollah threatened Israel, saying, we're not going to attack, but you're not going to drill gas in our area, particularly the block 8 and 9 that are disputed. And if you do that, it is a violation of our borders, then we will retaliate. This is why Israel negotiated with Lebanon indirectly, because Israel usually do not negotiate. They just grab what they want, and then go away with it. This time is different. They are trying to negotiate with Lebanon because they want, this area is very rich, and they put pressure, the French, the Americans, and the Israelis, on all the consortium companies, particularly Total, that is supposed to start drilling this 2020, this year, but they haven't started because they said we don't want to upset the Israelis. So this is the kind of pressure the Israelis are putting on the Lebanese, because the economic situation in the country is so bad that the Israelis are thinking that we can take advantage of the economic situation, put pressure on Lebanon, and saying, if you want gas and oil that you are buying with dollars and you're lacking the dollar today, you can start drilling in your own territory, in your own water, and we can agree and give us a little share. That is the position of the Israelis, and this is what the Americans are trying to convey to the Lebanese government. While the problem here is not all the Lebanese agree with this theory, and they prefer to remain under economic pressure, but not give concessions that are worth more or less $90 billion. We're talking about a reserve of gas that is worth around $100 billion that the Lebanese are not willing to give up. So by the power of the military force of the resistance, not the Lebanese army, because the Lebanese army is not allowed to have a military power, and the Americans do not allow for the Lebanese army to have deterrence weapons to stop any violation of its land, sea, and air. The Lebanese resistance, that is Hezbollah in this case, is stopping the Israelis from grabbing these 863 square kilometers and just go away with it.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you for that breakdown, Elijah. What is the role of the United Nations here? The UN has an interim force in Lebanon going back decades, back to 1978. What's their role? What are they doing there?
The United Nations have a very important role in writing down all the violations, the Israeli violations, that are several hundreds per month. And they send the report to the United Nations headquarters in New York. And this is all what they are doing. They're not doing anything, and they are on Lebanese soil. They're not on the other side because the Israelis refuse to have them. And what they do is they act as AWACS, so they're just a warning body for the Israelis to make sure that there are no trace of resistance armed groups on the borders that can bother the Israelis or make sure that they stop the Israelis from crossing the borders, because this is what the Israelis do from time to time. So basically the UN has a role today just to look at the maps that both sides are offering, but on the ground, basically they have no role, but they have some civilian role because they support few municipalities by creating roads, by digging some well here and there, by supporting schools. So they look after this side of the country, but part of this side of the country. But they don't do anything, and they were bombed several times by the Israelis, and many United Nations officers were killed by the Israelis, particularly in the city of Cana in 2 occasions when Israel bombed Lebanon.
Question, and I'm fascinated by this. It was something that you said, basically, what's the distinction? And distinction might be the wrong word for it, but how does Hezbollah relate to the Lebanese government? Because there seems to be a distinction between government, army, or for that matter, military, and Hezbollah. Hezbollah doesn't seem to be a military, even though it seems to be a military, but yet it also seems to be in some aspect of the government itself. Is there ever a situation where the government will make a choice? Say, for example, the government accepts whatever proposal is taking place here, and Hezbollah balks, and the government tries to go along with it anyway?
Well, the problem is much deeper than that. So if we go back to 1933, at the time of the Lebanese president Emil Iddi was ruling the country, he didn't want the south of Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, that are Shia. They didn't want Baalbek and didn't want Akkar, that are Sunni. He considered this is the great Lebanon. We, as a Maronite Lebanese, are not interested. We want to look after only the capital and the amount of Lebanon that is made mainly of 70% of Christian. And this is why they just neglected completely these sides and these part of the country, which are a very important part of the country, for fear of the demography overwhelming because the Muslims have more children than Christians. So what's happening is Hezbollah moved in and managed to force an Israeli withdrawal in the year 2000 after several years of resistance when Israel occupied Lebanon in 1982. And Hezbollah started to look after the infrastructure, the economy in these deprived areas that are neglected by the government and became part of the society. Hezbollah is no longer a group that is detached from the Lebanese society. It has 13 members of the parliament. It has 2 ministers, depending on the number of the cabinet. And it is not Hezbollah that is far away from the population. There are people who disagree with Hezbollah. They contest it, like people who contest the enemies of Hezbollah and contest the allies of Hezbollah. And some people contest Hezbollah itself. And on the other side, there are people who agree with Hezbollah. So it is kind of a consensus that is within the Lebanese government, where Hezbollah is called upon when ISIS and Al-Qaeda attacked Lebanon, because the Lebanese army was not in a position to defend the country as Hezbollah can, due to its armament and its ideological principle that enable it to face another ideological group like ISIS on the other extreme. This is why Hezbollah was called upon and was Lebanon was grateful for its invitation.
Elijah, let me interrupt you for one moment, and we can pick this up at the other end of the break. But this is the voice you're listening to is Elijah Magnier, veteran war correspondent and journalist. You can find his work on ElijahJM.wordpress. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you from the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. We're joined by veteran war correspondent and journalist Elijah Magnier. Am I pronouncing that last name correctly?
More or less, yes. It does the job. It's Magnier.
Magnier. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. So we were having a conversation basically on Middle East politics. Question: you're a war correspondent. I'm always enamored by war correspondents. What would you tell us about war that either an American audience or just the audience in general may not necessarily get, not having lived under war zones? Meaning 9/11 happened in New York, but from the standpoint of the United States being hit either in the First World War, Second World War, or for this, 9/11, those wars were abroad. Those were, we don't have a good sense, understanding of what it's like to live under war zones, even though our people go out and fight those wars. So what would you as a war correspondent tell us that we don't necessarily think of in the context of war?
Well, actually, the 30-odd years that I spent covering wars in different parts of the world, in Bosnia and Rwanda and Afghanistan, in Iraq and Syria and Iran, and different parts of the world, all these wars tell me that war is so ugly and we need really to not only report what's happening, but also explain to people why it is so bad to opt for the option of war. So we see analysts sitting in Washington, D.C., and advertising, pushing the U.S. administration, you should go to war with this country, you should go to war to that country. This is not a game. People die in war. Countries are destroyed. The amount of money that is invested on weapons that we see on the ground used every single day, if one side or both sides throw to each other food, nobody would ever be hungry. But instead, they buy weapons, they kill each other, and at the end of the day, they return to square one and they make a peace. And those who were killed, they say, well, collateral damage or war, or we are sorry, or we move on and life continue and we're all going to die. This is not an argument. If we look at the Middle East, the money that has been invested using Middle Eastern money against the Middle Eastern population can construct several times, I think, the whole earth because of the amount of hundreds of billions of dollars. If these money, I mean, if we take Saudi Arabia, spend $450 billion on buying weapons from the United States of America, how much do you think a country needs to build 10 universities, 10 hospitals, 20 companies to offer job opportunities, build up road, reduce the differences between social levels between this country and that country, open up? It costs much less than 450 billions. And we see this amount of money spent every single year, and people are building up all this weapon that we watch, and we see the effect is devastating on our ears. It's creating trauma to people, including ourselves. It creates a fear, because even if we go to wars and continue going to war, we have fear. We are afraid to in the field. There's nobody who is not afraid. But the level of difference, the level of fear is different. And then we see hospitals that are bombed. We see people rushing to hospital, losing their families. We see children becoming orphans. All that, it is something that people who have not seen the war still advertising for, because they don't know what is going to war. We are not military. We are not on the military side that will receive orders to shoot, to kill, and defend ourselves. No, we report what both sides are doing, and it is really bad what we see on both sides, and each side justify the wrongdoing to the other. This is what we learn from being at war, in a country at war, and covering it. And inevitably, sometimes we're not very objective, because when we live in a city that is bombed, we're going to talk about our feeling when we are living under the bombardment, like every single member of the society that is living there. We struggle with them. We are hungry like them when a city is sieged, like Sarajevo, 1993 to 1995. And we look for food every day like everybody else. And we understand what is hunger. We understand what is living in fear. And we try to tell people what is the price of war and what war can cost. Unfortunately, people read in newspaper just figures and don't go into really the feeling of what is war is about.
They don't get a gut.
That sounds incredibly painful and frustrating. And not, I mean, I'm going to say this. It sounds painful and frustrating as a job to have, which leads me to wonder, Elijah, why in the heck do you do this? I mean, I'll just let you take it. Elijah, please.
Well, why I do this? Because I think we all out to do something, and we all out to share, to have a responsibility towards the society. And my responsibility to tell people the truth and tell people what I see and make them feel a little bit, to a certain degree, what I feel, so they can tell their children not to go to war.
You know, the sad part about it is I don't think people really get it on a gut level. I think they see it on TV. I think, and honestly, this is one of those society things where your society rears kids in a particular direction, and in this country, soldiers are prized positions of sorts. It's when you're looking at the commercials, when you're seeing the advertisements, or for that matter, trying to get kids in colleges to go into the military, and we don't seem to have a good grasp of it. That's why I wanted you to explain, because you were there, you were on the ground. I mean, this is the Chris Hedges stuff too, where people who see it are horrified by it. And, it's not this thing of heroes of sorts. I mean, this is not, we don't have people trying to attack America coming over our borders. It's not that way. And yet we have all of this money that we're investing in the war, nearly $1 trillion. In the last conflict that you observed, who were the participants? What were the two sides?
Well, I tell you something. When American politicians are saying we want America to be safer, I mean, safer of what? You've been attacked by Al-Qaeda in 2001, and since you have attacked Afghanistan, you have attacked Iraq, you are attacked Syria, and you're still in Syria, and you have killed hundreds of thousands of people. I have colleagues who were shot by the Americans, who were journalists in Baghdad. They were sitting just next to me, just because we went close to an American vehicle where at the back it's written, "Do not come closer within 100 meters." But how can you see a panel behind the car from 100 meters? So you are shot at just because you did not observe a regulation that the Americans have put behind. So this is a kind of lightness to other people's life. How America is better and safer when America wants to dominate the world? Is it necessary to dominate the world? For what? Look at one single little small invisible virus is putting everybody off balance, including the strongest country in the world, that is United States of America. You give orders to soldiers to shoot and occupy a country. Right, okay, you have occupied Iraq in 2003. You didn't manage to bring peace. You can occupy any country you want, and then what? What do? Then you pull back and you say, oh, okay, that was a mistake. I mean, this mistake cost 500,000 dead. Is that a mistake? This is how we define our act of robbing other people's life. You know how many people join Al-Qaeda because their children or their parents or their brothers were killed by mistake, let's say, call it mistake, in the street, because it happened and they were there.
Yeah, we're creating our monsters.
Sorry?
I said we're creating our monsters. Yeah, I mean, in real terms.
Yeah, well, this is exactly what Hillary Clinton said. They said the Al-Qaeda that we are fighting today, we have funded, we have created, we have supported just to kick out the Soviet from Afghanistan, 1979, 1989, and then what we have done? We created Al-Qaeda, we created ISIS, because ISIS was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It is exactly the same ideology. This is what we have created. Every time the Americans go to occupy a country, and they beautifully succeed because they have the most wonderful military machine. But then what? Can you bring peace? Can you help people for democracy? Well, Trump said it. I don't give a damn about democracy. I just want the money from the Saudis and the Emiratis. So he's going out for money. And then what do you do with the money? You boost an economy on the bodies of people that you have killed in the Middle East. This is human. We're not built to be like that. We don't think of our fellow human being in this way. How I can rob you to take all your assets and dominate you, and then show the world how strong I am. This is what the Americans are doing today in the Middle East. This is what they are doing in Venezuela. They're imposing sanctions on Iran when Iran is under a very severe COVID attack, like most of Europe. So you prevent medicine, you prevent gasoline on Syria, you prevent wheat on the Syrian population. You starve the population by saying we make Iran better or Syria better. How can you make these countries better when you push them to starvation? It's just this logic.
I don't think the American public knows that. Like destroying the wheat fields, for example. Like Trump was very blunt and very clear. Yeah, I'm stealing the oil for all intents and purposes. He's saying protecting, but He's protecting the oil from the government of Syria. I mean, that's basically theft. That's like saying I'm protecting you from your wallet. But from the other side of that, burning crops. I mean, I don't think the public knows that this stuff takes place. And just to end this out, roughly, if I'm not mistaken, 1 or 2% of the American public is in the military, meaning it's the president's men, and you don't have the rest of the country meaning when the president does stuff with the military, the rest of the country doesn't necessarily feel it. They intellectually know it, but they don't necessarily get it in the gut level because it's not their family. It's a small percentage of the country. Do you think if the country knew and if the country felt it, that it would be less inclined to take these?
You've got to go out in like 20 seconds, man.
Oh yeah, that's fair. Okay,
you don't
that's
have
fair.
time.
Yeah, we're only gonna have a minute, so let's.
Elijah, yeah.
Elijah, we're gonna have to bring you back.
Guess.
Yeah, we're gonna have to bring you back because this was an awesome conversation, and I'm, like I said, I'm a sucker for war correspondence. I think I said that to Shane earlier. So this is the voice you've been hearing is Elijah Magnier, veteran war correspondent and journalist. You can find his work on elijahjm.wordpress.com. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're live and back from the break. You're listening to the most disruptive show in the divided states of this country, of America. In the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Line with Thomas and Stranahan. Oh man, I wonder, this is a completely random thought, but at some point, if like the sound effects aren't working, I just imagine us having to simulate, like I can be talking, I can be doing the headlines, and you can be like humming the background music. And then when we're going into the break, like I have to make like a crashing sound with my that kind of thing. That's these are waking fever dreams of a nightmarish reality I hope to never live through. Anyway, it's a non sequitur. Back to the actual news here. In the news, Republican chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, that's Lindsey Graham, sang the praises of Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett in the third day of hearings for her nomination, saying that, quote, "This is the first time in American history that we've nominated a woman who's unashamedly pro-life," end quote. His remarks cut into the concerns of many who are wary of an avowedly conservative Supreme Court. Barrett is widely expected to be nominated by the Republican-led Senate at the end of the month. And as we were talking about with Jim Jatras earlier, she could be in some sense the deciding vote, at least a deciding vote, in the contested election that many predict is going to hit us in about a month. A little bit less than that, but you know, it'll be about a month when the real brouhaha starts, assuming there will be one, because of course, votes takes time to count votes. It takes more time to count votes when a lot of those votes are getting mailed in. And yeah, we're going to have to deal with that. And she could be critical in that process. But the fact that the Democrats are pushing, you know, as you'd expect them to keep her from getting nominated, not that it's probably going to matter. That means that even it's not like she's contested too. Everything is contested, apparently. This is what a declining political system looks like, and it does not look pretty. Jamarl, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the thing is, from the standpoint of her and then putting her in that office, I think it is going to be a power grab in regards to the Supreme Court, and it's going to be a heavy shift to the right. And yeah, the ACA, the election, and even Roe v. Wade, all of those things at this point are up for grabs. Next time a Democrat is in office, and next time they have a Supreme Court pick, let's not try to be too lazy about getting that pick in. How about that? Because I hear a lot of Democrats right now complaining and flipping out and bitter and blaming Jill Stein, which is the weirdest thing in the world to blame Jill Stein. No, this is on you guys. Own it. You failed. You failed. Failure has consequences.
Man, I like that. I like that attitude. It's true. It's true. They have to take it, and hopefully they're soon replaced by something much, much better. Anyway, next headline here. President Trump and Joe Biden will hold competing town halls tonight. This comes in lieu of their now canceled second presidential debate. That cancellation came after online scuffling between the Trump and Biden campaigns over whether to go forward with the virtual debate following Trump's contraction of COVID-19. Trump last night held a rally in Iowa where he is reportedly in a dead heat with Joe Biden. Biden's town hall will be broadcast on ABC while Trump's will be held on NBC. And one quick addendum to this comes as Trump has apparently gotten many consecutive days, a handful at least, of negative tests for COVID. This also comes as Melania tested negative. And apparently, I'm throwing this one in here too, their son, Barron Trump, the weirdly tall for his age, Barron Trump, like very tall, like 6 foot. I don't even know what it is, but like he's apparently doing pretty well there. Anyway, he got COVID and now he's tested negative too. So yeah, the thing here, as far as I can tell, the official stated reason for canceling the event was, concerns over Trump spreading the coronavirus, him being a risk factor here. But that seems like, I guess they didn't want to push it off to the last minute. And so they're just like, all right, we're going to cancel this. That's the charitable explanation. Or more likely, in my opinion, there's some co-option going on, within that organization, within the committee responsible for handling these debates. And they're doing what's prudent for their political views. They're kind of doing Biden a favor in some sense by, instead of having him go head-to-head, toe-to-toe, maybe literally if they fly across the podiums at each other like they almost did last time, instead of having Biden do that with Trump live, they're each having their own town hall and they're each talking to their own audience. And this comes, Jamarl, as you mentioned, as there's like a hashtag and a movement to boycott NBC over hosting Trump.
Yeah, because they don't like the fact that Trump is going to be on their network, basically tearing down Democrats on what they see as a Democratic network. I mean, this is like the Fox stuff with Trump, where Trump says, like, I can't believe that network is treating me like this. Well, the network is not supposed to be a Trump network. It's supposed to be fair and balanced, quote unquote, as the ridiculousness goes. But MSNBC is every bit as much as a Democrats network. And this, if you're looking for confirmation, or at the very least evidence of such, this is definitely evidence.
It's ugly evidence. All right, next headline. In a 167-page report released on Thursday, Human Rights Watch said that attacks on civilian infrastructure in Idlib by the Syrian and Russian governments between April 2019 and March 2020 violated international law. And then I add my own editorial commentary. That is the official headline. I do not trust Human Rights Watch on this story. From what I've seen, supposedly independent, quote unquote, humanitarian organizations have often acted as a glove for the real fist within that glove that's pursuing Western interests in regime change wars. Idlib has been the site of numerous false flags, from what I can tell and from what many of our guests have said with good factual arguments. I don't trust it. I don't trust this. I see this. I mean, I don't want to be biased in the sense that I just outright reject things. But I haven't had time to go through this whole thing, but my inherent tendency is to be like, well, they've lied a lot. I think this came through Al Jazeera. That's how I saw it. But, it was initially disseminated by Human Rights Watch, of course, and people are just sort of echoing what they're saying in the Western press. That's how these things go. I don't trust it. I see them lying all the time. And this, of course, appears to me to be part of a coordinated campaign to continue to vilify the Russian government for Western interests, probably most specifically interest in the UK and most specifically in America. For whatever reason, we want to agitate for more wars and war spending, despite the fact that comes at the untold cost of human lives and a lot of human misery. We were just talking about that with Elijah Magnier. And literally the untold costs. We don't like to tell those costs. Jamarl, great conversation with Elijah, wasn't it? What's your take?
It was a great conversation with Elijah. We have to get him back on. I pulled him to the end of the break, and that's my fault because, it's like one question leads to the next. Look, the reason why we do that stuff is because the people who make the decisions aren't touched by the decisions. Like, it's if John McCain is basically looking to bomb pretty much any country on the planet Earth, and do so more than the military wants to do it at times. Well, I mean, John McCain, there's no feedback mechanism for him. He's not, at the very least at the moment before he passed, he's not on the ships doing the flying. He's not on the thing. He presses a button and somebody goes out and does it. Trump, same thing. When he goes out and he did that bombing for Syria, again, somebody went out and did it. Trump didn't fly the airplane himself. These guys make decisions, hit a button, and something happens. Somebody dies somewhere around the world. And there's no feedback. There's no consequence. It's not like the public drags them out of office for doing so. It's not like there's an uproar at them murdering, or killing. I mean, even when Obama was in office, there were some cases, 90% of the drone strikes were civilians. And so it's like there doesn't seem to be a mechanism that deals with this notion of what did they do versus how it's the response to them. And until you get that, I don't think it changes. I mean, you need to have some kind of consequence.
It's true. And I mean, this is in some sense where social media, new media, whatever terms you want to use, it's, largely happening through the internet. But that's not just social media companies, of course. It's where that comes in, I think. The establishment media does not like to talk about this stuff. They're trying, and in some cases pretty successfully, but by and large, I think unsuccessfully, they're trying to crowd out new media, the internet really. But there's still constantly this edge of hope that seems to recreate itself as people recognize the propaganda and push to create their own alternative platforms. And frankly, that's like the samizdat of the modern era that keeps free political thought alive. And if you're going to look and you're going to try to learn, I think that's where you've got to go. Anyway, next headline, don't mean to be too propagandistic in my own little way here, pushing my personal views. Next headline, police in Thailand arrested at least 20 after an emergency ban on gatherings. This came as they dispersed a group of protesters who camped out overnight outside the office of the prime minister to demand his resignation. That led him to implement a severe state of emergency in the capital area. And again, police arrested more than 20 people for violating that state of emergency. They have not, however, been officially charged, but among them were protest leaders. So, that's happening. Kyrgyzstan's President Jeanbekov has resigned, and Zadir Japarov, who only days ago was behind bars, serving a sentence for kidnapping a public official, has become the country's new head of government. Early last week, crowds stormed the parliament building. The country's prime minister and speaker of the parliament resigned. One person, that's a 19-year-old man, was killed amid clashes. The deputy speaker of parliament, Mirlan Bakirov, a member of Magnier Kyrgyzstan, a party connected with the Kyrgyz kingmaker Raimbek Matreyimov, proposed Japarov for the role of prime minister. Masses of supporters began to rally around Japarov. Some were drawn by his nationalism and the promise to give back to the people the privatized gold mines, the, quote, stolen, end quote, national wealth. I'm going to quote here from a Kyrgyz academic. This is Asel Dulotkeldieva, who said, quote, I think nobody can tell really how it's possible that Japarov jumped from a place of detention immediately to the highest echelons of power. Nobody can answer this question currently, and it's puzzling all of us. Was it an orchestrated plan by a group of people who wanted to take advantage of the revolts and advance their own interests, or was it a spontaneous act by Japarov's supporters? We don't know, end quote. This also comes, however, as Japarov is very popular, from what I can tell, widespread support. And it's interesting to me how quickly this stuff happens in a moment of political crisis. You sort of seize onto what's available. And I kind of want to see if I'm making a statement there that I don't have. I'm living through one in some sense now, but this is not the level of crisis. I don't think, Kyrgyzstan's president has just stepped down, just resigned. That hasn't happened in America. We might be building up to a moment like that, but that could come a decade away. And I kind of want to see, not for any personal desire to live in that crisis, but I just want to see if I'm right. Do people get really irrational? Do we seize onto things really, really quickly because it's the only hope? It's like there's the lifeboat floating in the frozen sea and you want to get on it. You get what I'm saying, Jamarl?
Yes.
Is that going to happen?
Yeah, people do that. I mean, people are, look, we're rational beings. At the very least, what we consider to be rational in regards to the way people think about stuff and try to deal with things. And yeah, if they're incentivized, I mean, why do you think people come here? like from South America. We've like torched and destroyed many of those countries. And some of those places become war zones, and people logically flee war zones, even in Syria, where you had all of those people flooding into Europe. Yeah, I think it's just rational. I mean, you know, how do you see it? But I see it as just, it's rational for people to behave in ways that lessen pain, and that increases their access to the things that they need, and move in that direction.
It's just, I'm saying this from a sort of like young, naive perspective, which, you know, legitimately I'm a younger dude than, plenty of people here. So not acting from experience. I've heard that this happens. I've never lived through it. And it kind of, you feel like you're not the kind of person who would go along with it, but undoubtedly, probably I would. I'm going to throw this in as a last quick headline here. Japan's financial services agency will move online within the next year and a half. Moving all applications and filings from banks, insurance companies, and other financial institutions online by the end of March 2022 under Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga's push to digitize the government. This comes as at the end of March 2019, about a year and a half ago at this point, Japan's financial services agency required paper submissions for 1,612 of the 1,767 applications and filings under its purview. This meant an online option existed for only 8.8% of them. Now, 70 years ago, that would have been like, whoa, you can do 8.8% of your filings through a computer? We're still using Steam for that. No, we never use Steam for computers, but I'm kind of kidding. At this point, though, it seems outdated to not be doing it. And frankly, of course, they probably should. More countries should probably follow suit. Estonia, seen as a world leader in online governance, also has digitized almost all government forms, including those on financial matters. And Japan may soon follow in their wake. With that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going to go into a break. We will be back in just a minute talking with Danny Haiphong. Stay tuned, folks. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usually flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and share the video. And if you want to join the conversation, you can send a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Feel free to call. But joining us right now, Danny Haiphong, contributor to Black Agenda Report and co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People History of Fake News. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys for having me.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. We're in the midst of an election, of course. News just came out yesterday that Joe Biden apparently, the meetings and the relationships with the Ukraine. Washington Post is now saying that an email that was retrieved apparently was not what it said it was. And we have two candidates who, I got to be honest, I mean, Trump supporters love Trump. So what, 80% of Trump supporters back Trump because he's Trump. But 70% of Biden supporters are backing Biden because he is not Trump. Meaning it's not an aspirational pitch, despite the fact you have all of these issues that avail us. Why do we produce, meaning America, why do we produce candidates like this? Meaning Joe Biden makes the argument that he is clearly what America wants because the primary process chose him. Is he right? Is Joe Biden really what America wants because the primary process chose Joe Biden?
Well, certainly there are sections of the United States that want someone like Joe Biden. But as I wrote in my article, really how the United States is constructed, how there is this sickness that plagues the United States, and that is that it's actually a dictatorship and not a democracy, and it's a dictatorship of capital. And so capital certainly wants Joe Biden. People who are aligned with capital certainly want Joe Biden. That's basically his entire base are those folks who see Donald Trump not as a disaster in the policy realm, but really as an embarrassment to what the United States should be, which is a country that can commit crimes domestically and abroad, can impoverish hundreds of millions domestically and abroad, can be the incarcerator in chief around the world, can be the warmonger around the world, and still obtain and uphold an image of exceptionalism and of superiority and of this so-called advanced civilization, while Donald Trump is really a challenge to that in the sense that he embodies, look at how he acted during his experience with COVID-19 pandemic, his own personal experience. He is almost the epitome of what the United States really is underneath the surface. And so really what we see is just a division between the two candidates, not on policy, so to speak, but on the optics of how the United States really should present itself.
And for you, Danny, I'm curious, who would be an ideal president? I'm pretty sure you're not going to say Biden. I know you're not going to say Trump. I'm not sure whether or not you'd say Bernie. It doesn't have to be a person specifically, but in terms of characteristics, ideals, what they're going for, just for you, who would that be?
Well, it's hard to say what kind of individual would be an ideal president because, as we know, as we've seen with Bernie Sanders even, despite the fact that he was a social democrat at heart, not even his politics could survive within the two-party duopoly. So I think the real question is, how do we change the political system in the United States, the way that the United States is governed, so that the politics that really majorities of people want, the policies that people want, universal health care, addressing the environmental destruction of the planet, assisting and addressing the mounting and growing poverty that people face amid this Great Depression. That's really what most people want in the United States, but they'll never get that from the two-party duopoly.
Well, as I see it, basically you have the issue of class. I mean, it would be weird for people of a particular class, let's say a 1%, to look after the other part if they don't have to. Like, if you get this point where you have a lock on your government, where you have basically, 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash, which right there, meaning your system is basically soaking, just sloshing in a river of cash, where these candidates get, buku's amounts of money, and not just cash, meaning from the standpoint of money that they get, but money also that could be used against them if they not take a position, or even favors, like from companies and so forth. I guess my point is, if you have a system that is ensconced in cash like this, how do you ever shake that and change that? Because ultimately, the belief system is going to run in line with the cash. You have dollars or pitchforks. In this case, you don't have any pitchforks. You just have dollars. So how do you change that? I mean, and is it possible to change that, considering all of the incentives go for them to do exactly what they're doing?
Well, you're exactly right. I think the only way that it can change, and Frederick Douglass said this, power concedes nothing without a demand. I think that people who really do want policies to change in the United States in favor of the working class, even if it may not be possible as the society is currently constructed, it's almost imperative for, if there's any chance, if there's any possibility that the two-party duopoly will respond to the masses of people. The only way that happens is if the masses of people are demanding what they want and also acting upon those demands and making sure that politicians like Donald Trump and Joe Biden cannot escape accountability. And right now, we don't have that kind of mass movement in the United States that is capable of putting the pressure on.
Well, and it seems, this is a slightly change of topic, but it seems like there's something inherent to a mass political system or even a mass political movement where, if you have a degree of centralization in terms of information and organization, if people are not only following the same leaders, but they're reading the same books, listening to the same radio shows, et cetera, watching the same YouTube channels, to fit the modern era a little bit more closely. If they're all sort of a piece, isn't that centralized instrument itself susceptible to power? You said, I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't remember the exact quote, but you were quoting somebody else. Power doesn't change without a demand. But if that demand doesn't itself have power, or if its power is easily co-opted by power, and I don't know which is worse, then where's that next step? What's your take, Danny?
Well, in the United States, I think it varies depending on where we're talking about. So in the United States, we are in a situation where working people, ordinary people, oppressed people do not have power. They do not have the ability to shape or determine their destinies based on what they actually need and also what they actually want. Sometimes those things go together. Sometimes there is a divergence in those two things. So I think that's the difference between, let's say, a socialist country like China, which has a government that vast majority support and that actually addresses the needs of people and thus is able to curry an approval rating. And so you have the difference between centralization, right, and its opposite in China all at the same time. You have centralization in the state. The state meets people's needs, but there's also attention to local characteristics, right? The whole poverty alleviation campaign would not be possible unless there was attention to local characteristics of each village, of each county, of each province. If there wasn't that attention, then it wouldn't work. And ultimately, people would be disgruntled. And what we would see is the persistence of something like extreme poverty rather than the near eradication of it by the end of this year.
By the way, how did they go about doing that? I mean, there are two points. Is it possible that the differences in ideology explains why one government is liked versus the other, not necessarily policy? Meaning, the United States has somewhat of a rocket system that has just gotten worse over time, where people fight back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. And even though I agree with you, it's a duopoly. It's which is just one more than a monopoly. I agree with you on that point, but it is also true, though, that because of they may have a different ideological framing of the world that allows them to be more in line with their government's points of view. That's one point. But on the second point, how did they go about their poverty alleviation program? Like, what were the steps that they took to try to eliminate that in the country? We have about 2 minutes, and we can take you in on the other side, but you can start here.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be as fast as possible. I think that China, it's both about the character of the government as well as the ideology. So really, the Communist Party is in the lead, and the Communist Party sees poverty alleviation as an integral part of its overall mission. So how that's been done, there's so many steps, but really it's about attention to the poorest in the countryside and then sending folks out there and this is what's remarkable, to work for sometimes years at a time within some of the poorest, most remote villages to ensure and not being able to leave. These are some of the youngest people within the party. Go there and have to work with the villagers, have to work with the poorest of the people in order to get them out of poverty. And if they do not succeed, they are not leaving that village for so-called greener pastures. So there's an incentive in the sense that this overall policy framework ultimately brings rewards. It brings not only the entire upliftment of the country, but it also is tied to how you can even operate within the Communist Party. When you join, you have to join this campaign. You have to go to the countryside. You have to work with those who are struggling to just make ends meet, struggling to just grow food, struggling in these areas where sometimes there isn't even the possibility of growing enough food to live and to actually afford something like an education. So that, I think, is where the campaign has really been successful, is in integrating the party with the poorest of the people. And right now in the United States, we don't have a party that represents the poorest of the people that wants to do that wants to address these problems. And I think that's the big difference.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. I mean, if they can do it, certainly we can do it. We have they have 1.3 billion people. We have 320 million, give or take. You guys are listening to the voice of Danny Haiphong, contributor to the Black Agenda Report and co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Shooting from the left.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Danny Haiphong. He's a contributor to the Black Agenda Report and the co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News. You can also, by the way, follow Danny on Twitter at Spirit of Ho, and check him out on patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. You can also, of course, read his work at blackagendareport.com. Danny, thank you again for being with us. I'm going to start here. We kind of wanted to have a conversation that we got into towards the tail end of that last segment about localism. But I'm curious about your opinion on something a little bit more philosophical, going back into some of the roots of modern political thought here. What's your take on not the modern liberalism, but liberalism as a sort of philosophical concept, going back to thinkers like Hume, Locke? Arguably, Locke is probably the latest date that people would put on its arrival, but you can trace it a bit earlier on. What's your opinion on liberal thought?
Well, liberal thought, in my opinion, really formed out of the development of capitalism and of the early genesis of capitalism. So on the one hand, liberal thought represented a huge break from feudalism, from the rule of monarchies, hereditary passage of power, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, it also opened up a new form of economic organization under capitalism, which had its own characteristics born out of feudalism, but also unique to capitalism in the sense that now the world was not divided upon merely landowners and the landless and the lords and the serfs. Now it was divided into the proletariat, the workers, as well as their literally their owners or their employers, the capitalists. So liberal thought really represents, I think, classical liberalism especially represents almost the purest form of what that system is, which is, on the one hand, hundreds of years ago, a step forward, but on the other hand, for many people around the world, also a step backward. So I think it represents so many things, but I'll just say that that's just my interpretation of what liberalism has represented over the last several centuries.
Thank you. You know what? I'm going to be honest. I completely agree with you. We're of the same mind on this. We probably have different sort of valences, different emotional feelings about those ideas, about the consequences. But if it's okay, I'm going to follow up on that. What do you see as being wrong with that? I think that's I'm going to give it back to you in a second, but I think that's pretty pivotal to understanding the conceptual side of debates between ways of life in China and America, other countries around the world. It's like a pivotal issue. So for you, where do you think it goes wrong?
Well, I think that for me, it's less about wrong or right, and it's more just about what are the conditions that liberalism sort of justifies under a sort of capitalist world economic system. And I think that the way that capitalism develops over time, and this has always been true from the very beginning, but there is this developmental process from early capitalism to the more concentrated form that we see today, is that it rests upon exploitation. It rests upon exploitation of labor. It rests upon the exploitation of the environment. It does require war. There's never been a period under capitalism where there hasn't been a need for war in order for capital to expand and to accumulate. I think that spirit of competition, while on the one hand did eviscerate this entrenched monarchical, feudal way of organizing humanity, it also opened up for the rapacious greed, inequality, and the ultimate consequences of what we see today, which is this contradiction of monopoly versus contradiction, this idea of individualism versus the actual reality, which is that really when capitalism develops into its final stages, it becomes an imperial monstrosity to the point where really we see monopolies controlling political policy, political governance at a level of destruction that's almost unseen in any prior social system.
That brings up an interesting question then, if we're talking about China. If China is trying to grow and develop, meaning let's say not as a militaristic country, let's say they just want to develop and elevate the public itself, meaning they want to bring the public up to a standard of living and they want to continue to do that and they want to sell products, etc. Well, they still have to deal with a hostile world. And like you said, the capitalist countries, the United States specifically, has started opening, both all barrels, whether it's military in the South China Sea or whether it's propagandistic from the standpoint of attacking like Huawei or the other company here, I think it was called Weibo. Then how does China expand and accomplish their vision in a hostile world? Because I would make the case that the Soviet Union, part of the reason they probably fell or had to do with the hostility of the world around it. Well, China is also going to have to deal with a United States and a Western world that's hostile, whether it's Trump in the way he's going about it or whether it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the way that Obama wanted to go about it. So what's the policy for that? What's the policy of trying to defend their borders while simultaneously expanding their domestic their home economy?
Very, very good question. China has done something pretty unprecedented, I think, in the history of the struggle out of capitalism. So we just talked about feudalism to capitalism, that transition. Well, China represents a movement that the Soviet Union also represented, which was the movement from capitalism to socialism, to break out of the contradictions that capitalism brings us to another type of social organization. And I think that what China has done is pretty unprecedented. The Soviet Union was not able to achieve this, both because of the hostile world order. I think some of it had to do with political leadership, with lack thereof. But I think for China, one of the things that it did was to integrate itself into the world economy. That has had its consequences. I mean, inequality is a problem in China as well, and it's something that is on the policy agenda, unlike here. Things like income inequality are talked about, and there is a concerted effort to address it. But to integrate yourself into the world economy, to open yourself up to cooperation, to trade and investment from countries that are ultimately competitors, like Europe, like the United States, like Japan, to be able to do that and also maintain your particular form of social organization, so that that kind of investment trade with these competitors does not lead to externalities, does not lead to dependency, does not lead to you having to abandon things like poverty alleviation, like addressing pollution, like being able to develop a public health system that can mobilize during a pandemic. That has been the way that China has defended itself in a hostile world. People don't remember that prior to 1972, China was diplomatically isolated and economically isolated from the world. And that had huge consequences for China. Despite the progress they made after the revolution, China was very poor. I mean, it wasn't until the 1990s where China really began to industrialize. And with a country that is majority countryside, majority peasant, not being able to bridge that gap between town and country, city and countryside, that means that poverty has remained a huge problem up until really the last 5 to 10 years, where China has made a huge push to eradicate it. And that's only been possible by access to the world economy.
Let me ask you this. In part of those plans in getting rid of inequality, because I was reading about that part also, where the inequality just spiked in China. It almost seems to be just the natural consequence of the capitalistic system, right? It's a tool, and that tool just pushes money up in a particular direction. Do they have any plans on dealing with the capitalists that revolt? Meaning the elements and the members of China? Because at some point, if you're talking about inequality, you're basically talking about somehow diminishment of cash from one group to another group. And the group that has it often feels like something is being ripped away from them. Oh, you're stealing something from me. How are they going to deal with that, especially with the inequality in China? Or is this going to be another ideological thing where they're just going to be perfectly okay with giving up their ends?
Right, that's another really good question. Well, I think that one of the ways it's been dealt with, especially in the last 7 years or so, is through the anti-corruption campaign and through the focus on ensuring that government bodies, that the public sector, so to speak, in China remains free from that kind of corruption, from that kind of inequality. So one of the ways this manifests in China is that local governance can often become very susceptible to the problems that you speak of in terms of how money, how influence can ultimately get you things that maybe ordinary people can't get. So the focus has really been on ensuring that local administration, local party governance, local city governance, municipal governance is not able to become a servant of the folks that are making more money out of these market mechanisms. And that allows local prefectures, cities, counties, villages to then adhere to the central plan, which is outlined by the party, which is outlined by the Nationalist People's Congress, of addressing the problems, but based on the local characteristics of those places. So you can begin to address the issue of poverty, the issue of pollution, the issue of infrastructure development, which is still a major question in China for many villages, especially in the south. That, I think, is how it's done. And it's done in a very sensitive environment, right? Because, as you said, there is a hostile world situation. And there's also a situation where you do need to ensure that those who are really winning the most out of capitalist market mechanisms are not able to take over the governance system in China. And there's so many checks in order to prevent that from happening. That's why you see, even though there are millionaires and billionaires in China, they make up a very small fraction of any form of governance from the local level all the way up to the top.
You guys have been listening to the voice of Danny Haiphong, contributor to Black Agenda Report and co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News. Danny, thank you for coming on to the show, man. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you inviting me. Thanks so much, guys.
Absolutely. So,
Thanks, Danny.
Great segment with Danny. So let's do this. Let's take a break, and we're going to come up with Shane's, what do we call it? The rap. Shane's The Rap. And you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're also taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call if you want to call us. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Jamarl, it is the wrap. It might be the wrap up. It could be the lettuce wrap. It might even be a falafel wrap.
It's all you.
I don't know, but we're a couple of hours in, and maybe it's just me, but I'm getting hungry. I'm also, this is a complete tangent, I'm also fasting. I'm like a day and a half into a fast here, and it's going well. I'm feeling very good. But, food, even lettuce, which is normally not the most appetizing of foods, is like, oh, that'd be crisp and watery and vaguely.
On day 3, it gets easier. And day 4 gets easier still.
No, it's true. It is totally true. Yeah, and especially if you're taking the right stuff on the side, you know what I mean? Our bodies are definitely adapted to handle this kind of thing unless you're horribly ill. Anyway, we've got a caller. I'm gonna go to him in a second. But I kind of wanted to do a little bit of a wrap up from that last segment. I was asking him those questions about liberalism. I asked him what was wrong with it. And it was, I guess, I want to have him back on to talk about it. It was interesting. When he answered the first question, I heard him saying, like, it sounded like he thought there was stuff wrong with it. He was saying it was sort of a conceptual appendage to capitalism, or the purest form of the philosophy of capitalism.
Yeah.
And I can't help but agree. But then when I asked him what was wrong with it, he sort of said he didn't, and I don't want to misrepresent him, but he sort of said that he didn't think there was something wrong with it. Which is interesting because I hear him criticizing capitalism too.
Well, yeah, he said there was positives and negatives. I mean, I think that's the way he was dealing with it. And yeah, he compared it to capitalism.
What I find weird about it.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, for all of the complaints, I don't think any socialist would say that capitalism is all negative. I don't think that at all. And so I don't think he would take a maximalist position on it, if that makes sense.
Well, I know you're not a socialist, but I want to hear you say, in your opinion, what are the positives of capitalism?
I would say this little engine that could, per se. I mean, like, people, if you have one of those things where you're always in this thing where there's a comparison between government versus individuality. And there's this kind of balance between this kind of two things, meaning you have a collective and you have the individual. And you need the collective, for the most part, have a certain stick-to-itiveness in order to have a society where the individual, to some degree, does not want to be held under the whims of that collective will, depending, and so forth. I do think, to some degree, capitalism is a tool for that. I mean, ripping us out of the feudal societies or that type of thing. But the issue is, can you do something better? And that's the point that people always miss. Like, is there even an incremental change that can make the system better? And to me, the answer is yes. And that change would be, I don't know how libertarians argue with the notion of having people having more agency in the jobs that they have by having stake in the companies that they work. Now, like we had Mark Frost on, who disagreed with that. I mean, he didn't disagree with that. He basically said yes. And then
I think it was Tom. I think it was Tom Luongo.
Tom Luongo, I'm sorry.
You're thinking about Tom.
Where Tom, he didn't disagree with it. He just kind of pivoted to something else. He was like, yeah, but the libertarians may have a different idea of it too. I do think the little
no. Here's what he was saying.
Well, wait. One point.
I remember what he was saying.
Quick point. I don't want the government making cars. So, you know what I mean? Like, if that's what I mean by positive. There are things that human beings make because those human beings are specific within a craft or specific within a thing that they do. And so I do think it's a positive for those people to be able to make a living off of doing something. But let's be clear, but I don't think anybody makes the argument that they're all negatives for capitalism, if that makes sense. Like even,
No, but I think that people disregard the positives. I think that's crucial. And I'm not trying to put you in a spot. I'm just like, I've almost universally heard you say negative things about capitalism. Usually when we have arguments, it's sort of me playing a devil's advocate position. And in a lot of cases, genuinely defending, elements of capitalism that I like and appreciate and value. Yeah. But anyway, I mean, real quick with Tom, what I heard him saying was just that people don't necessarily want that. If you're just trying to get into a job, I think is pretty much exactly what he was saying. If you just want to make money, if you just want to go work for a company on a contract for a year, you don't really care about having some stake in the company. And I think the implication there is, why should the government do the democratization stuff? That's at least one implication of it. Why should there be laws in place that require employee ownership of companies when some people, frankly, a lot of people should just be, the libertarian take is they should just be left to determine what company they're going to work for. They should be left to determine that stuff for themselves. And then if people want to create democratized companies, then they should do that. Well, and if that works, then,
Yeah, he did say both. I mean, he basically said, some people may not want to do it. Some people may want to. And fair enough.
Let them decide.
Right. But come on. I mean, they're not really entirely deciding. I mean, if the person is working at Walmart, the Walton family is going to do everything they can to pay that person as little as possible. Now, and this is kind of where the negatives of it come in. And, where it's like this lust or this greed and the way a small number of people hold all of these resources and control all of the resources, I think that's insane. And so if a person wanted to make pencils...
It's two monopolies.
Well, it's not just monopolies.
I want to get down...
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I want to get down to it because I think there's a real philosophical fork. There's there's something on this axiomatic level, straight up. You had the rise of capitalism in response to not just feudalism, but despotism. You had the rise of absolute monarchies in the 1600s. It was like the peak of absolute monarchy. And that's coming a couple centuries into the earliest date that people usually put for a pin for the start of capitalism. But you have this right. From monarchical power, from governmental power, to quote unquote private power, to corporations, which, many of whom in the early stages worked with the governments at the East India Trading Company, which is kind of a part of the United Kingdom, the British Empire, that whole thing. You get where I'm going with this.
Yeah, those are basically armies, little company armies of sorts.
Yeah. And it's weird because it's in the process, it's like you're rebelling against one monopoly and you're creating a system. And it's this weird, complicated, it's not this simple. You're creating a system that leads to another monopoly. In the first case, it's a monopoly on force. The second case, it's something like a monopoly on opportunity, and these are silly high-level words that aren't going to really get at the meat of the matter, but that does seem to me to be the fundamental flaw in the modern version of capitalism. Now, a lot of people would argue that capitalism, this is another one of these little contradiction things. I think a lot of people will argue that capitalism is built on competition, and in some sense it is. And in a weird sense, we've also applied that argument to government sort of retrospectively.
It does.
That the best governments are balanced governments, that the most viable international orders are balanced international orders. That whole strand of thought, it seems to me, we adopted as a result of our thinking about competition, as a result of our thinking specifically about competition between, various public entities to create this balance of political control and representation, and also, competition between private and public in general, just that fundamental thing. Anyway, there are so many, we talked before about ideology. I feel like there's a lot of stuff still to be worked out, philosophically, conceptually, whatever, in terms of the ideas that guide our government and society. I feel like we haven't resolved those contradictions yet. And, if you make some progress on it, if you start to work on it a bit, you might get some really fruitful stuff out of it. You might get some really interesting ideas and some really interesting responses. Another way of looking at this, and this is kind of why actually not why I was asking it, but something that came to mind as a result of asking it. It seems like communism, fascism, and liberal democracy, which are this the holy untrinity or holy trifecta or whatever, unholy trinity of the modern political era. You had these going up against each other in World War II, in large part. Liberal democracy, of course, teamed up with communism on the Allies side at the end of the war. At least that's how it worked up. And it was going up against fascism on the Axis side. And those are sort of the three political poles that have defined political thought. But to me, it seems like it's all coming from capitalist thought. It's all coming in some sense. It's all sprouting from the individualist liberal philosophy. It's certainly all a reaction to it. With communism, now that you with liberalism, if you break people down into individuals who are atoms, like molecular atoms that have been broken apart into their individual constituent atoms, and you view those atoms as having individual rights, those people, to be clear, as having individual legal rights and the right to equal legal representation ultimately. Once you've done that, then you kind of have to balance that out, because human nature doesn't work so simply. And what you get as a response to that is either association through economics, which is capitalism, or association through class and the attempt to resolve class, which is communism, or you get ethno-nationalism, you get ethnic groupings, which is fascism. All of those three ways of looking at things are in some sense accurate. And I'm not approving of any of them, because I think they're all pretty incomplete and deficient, and each one of them has killed many, many, many millions of people. But yes, people associate with their cultures. That's a sort of fascist argument. I don't think you should force people to associate with their cultures, though. And frankly, I think we're all better off for not having to associate with just our cultures. And of course, people are also bound by class. People have some self-consensus. Some self-conception. And through that, a consensus socially about what class they're in and how they're supposed to respond to people in higher positions of power. And of course, the economy is like this material underpinning and network bridge thing that ties people together. Those are all true in some sense, but they're also all incomplete if you try to create this polarity, this conceptual polarity, and use that as your political philosophy. I've been rambling. Jamarl, does that make sense?
I think I know where you're going with that. You're making the point that each one of them, in and of themselves, are incomplete, and that a larger system where we as humanity can kind of get together without having the defects is still unclear. But it has to contain some, if not all, of those elements. I think that's where you're going with that. Meaning, you can't have a system where there's an overlord and the individual has no rights. By the same token, people do need to work together, and they do need to work in a collective way in order to build other things. Nothing gets built without, group support. And ethnicities and this kind of weird way that the man animal and birds and everything else seem to identify with its own. And I suppose it's just being born that way. So I think that's the way I take it, as the way you're trying to explain it and articulate it, that something's missing, but there are parts of it that are here.
Yeah. You know what? Let's go to calls. We've got two callers real quick. Let's go through these really quickly. Tarif, you've got about 30 seconds. Tarif in New Orleans, what's on your mind?
Oh, how y'all doing? Okay. Free Julian Assange, hashtag Free Julian Assange. Help out Evil Bullet and also Vanessa Bailey. Oh, okay. Africa is facing in the next week, coming weeks and months, massive starvation. 30 million people around, throughout the world is facing it. Most of them live in Africa. U.S., Canada, Brazil, Russia and China need to work out proposals to start shipping food to Africa and work out deals or low interest loans or maybe aid or something to ward off this starvation in Africa because of the pandemic.
Tarif, interesting take. Tarif, thank you for calling, but man, we've got to go. We've got one more call. Malik, you've got about 20 seconds. Please, what's on your mind?
Hey, what's up, fellas? I'll try to be as succinct as possible. How can you guys, and I guess the gentleman's named Tom Luongo, who comes on and speaks about libertarianism and capitalism? I believe that's him. How can you guys say that there is any positives that the general public, especially the oppressed, should see in capitalism, as capitalism was built on the backs of Africans and the divide of the African continent? It is an inherent parasitic system. And I would love to speak with Tom about white people's identity.
Malik, thank you for the call. We've got to go, and that's an interesting conversation. We'll have Tom Luongo on again soon. We also have Mark Frost on pretty frequently. If you're listening during those segments, I'd recommend calling in. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Thank you to our producers, Cam and Raheem. Thanks to engineer Andre, and thank you, my co-host, Jamarl. We'll be back tomorrow. Signing off, folks. Have a good day.
Yeah, Malik, you're going to have to call back in. Call back in during the show. That should be a good conversation. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, look, I mean, this is kind of like intellectual honesty. That's the way I see it. Parasitical system, yes. Oppressive, yes. A chain in regards to the way society can function and operate, meaning you don't have a flying car, or you don't have the tubes, or the best interest is out of reach because of, this kind of economic cost in the background, or the corruption that is inspired and incentivized by a system where greed is just paramount. So, no, I get it. But by the same token, the government should make cars. I think it's a weird thing to say the government should make pencils. There are certain things that I don't think should be made by this kind of collectivist grouping. And so the question is, well, how do you do that? And is there a way to maneuver from this to not do that? This is kind of the technological argument that I tend to make, where I say our society should basically revamp itself technologically. I mean, many of the jobs that people do are bullshit jobs. Those things aren't necessary. Our society has this thing where it says, well, if a person doesn't work, a person shouldn't eat, despite the fact that you could literally create systems where you retire at 30 or 40 or something, as opposed to working your entire life. Our world don't have to be this way. And so, Malik, yeah, I agree with you. It's an oppressive, parasitic, inherently racist system. And yeah, I would say call back in when Tom is on. The thing is, though, Tom has a tendency to filibuster. There's that. But no, definitely call back in when Tom is on. That'll be a good conversation to have. And Mark, look, these guys look at this from the individual perspective. But to a, what I would call, ridiculous degree. It's not that their arguments are bad. They make very good points, and they make their, fight their case. And at the end of the day, it's ideological. But, I do think if I am thinking of 300 million people, let's say in the United States, and I think, okay, there's a small number of people who ended up as, let's say, capitalists, then where should my deference be? Should it be towards that small number of people that have been able to make bukus amounts of bucks? And congratulations, we're glad that you were able to make those bukus amounts of bucks, but you weren't able to do it without your employees. And fact of the matter is, your company would not exist without those employees. Your company would not exist without people buying those products. And unfortunately, we've accepted this idea that these guys should have control of all those resources. I don't buy it. And the exploitation regarding the labor is one of those things that hits the bottom people the most. I guess my point is, why would I look at it from the perspective of the minority as opposed to the perspective of the majority of people who, at the end of the day want to be able to live their life and make their ends? And this particular system favors one side over the other. So, no, I agree with you. Totally agree. All right, I'm going to end this here. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for joining us. Fault Lines, Thomas, and Stranahan. You'll see me in a few.